Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable and relax. Everyone thinks I'm crazy or that I had a vivid dream, but I know the truth and I have to tell it somewhere before they convince me it never happened, in hopes someone believes me and avoids meeting them. I was entering in a pretty anonymous wood in the northern Italian mountains to pick up some mushrooms, as I often did when the season was right. Immediately something felt out of place. The air wasn't as cold as the gray late autumn day would suggest, but following the warm airstream I was finding more and more mushrooms, so I didn't stop to wonder about it. Then I started to hear a flute which weirded me out. It came from deep in the woods, seemingly where the warm air was coming from. I admitted I was charmed and followed it despite knowing deep down it wasn't wise. I ended up in a clearing where the season seemed to change. The sunlight was bright and warm. Birds who should only be around in spring were chirping, and in the middle of it was a girl, playing the flute on a tree stump. Feeling alienated by the sheer contrast with my common sense, I sat down to listen, and she joined me. We simply looked at each other, and she was beautiful with her white hair and amber-colored eyes. We instinctively leaned to kiss when the birds flew away, scared, and she recoiled. At first, I was confused. Then I saw them. Shadows lurking closer and closer, whispering things I couldn't understand. But that filled me with dread. She got up as if to shield me, but we were surrounded. I could see the fear in her eyes as the shadows were close enough to be perfectly visible. Creatures, if they can be called that, with a body that looked halfway between solid and a cloud-like texture, of a black like nothing I've ever seen. As if darkness itself was alive in front of me. But that was nothing. Not even the deadly fangs and claws were what really scared me. The damned eyes, flickering points of light, shining in a seemingly void and never-ending abyss inside the creature. They looked and felt completely against nature. Yet they were there, closing in on us. She created a door of light somehow and pushed me in. I could see the shadows jumping on her and her sad expression while she muttered, "Goodbye," her only word since I met her. When I opened my eyes, I was at the edge of the woods. I thought I dreamt everything, but my basket was full of mushrooms. With my heart full of fear, I looked back, and sure enough, those shadows were coming for me. And they were fast. I ran for my life. Now that the whispers were for me, my instincts could understand them. Those creatures prey on life, any life, and it was my turn to be caught. Running wasn't enough with my speed. The shadows caught up and even cut my skin superficially with their claws. I barely made it into the car and got out full speed, but one of those creatures was on top of my car and slowly it was spreading, engulfing the car until I was running into a completely void space. I was about to give up and accept whatever fate was in store for me when a light broke through. The girl from the clearing was back to save me again. I managed to get out, but I saw her stomach pierced and the blood coming out of her mouth before countless shadow creatures swarmed her. I again woke up, this time in my car. I could see my skin cut from the claws, the car damaged, and my mushroom basket was full. I got out and tried to tell the police, only to end up in a mental facility. I know that it really happened even if no one believes me, and I'm here to tell everyone to avoid the shadows of the woods or unnatural warm places, because I might have not understood what happened that day, but one thing I know. We lost the beacon that was keeping that darkness away from us, and they're coming. I wake up every night screaming, and as they sedate me, I pray that when those creatures finally invade, our souls may be able to escape that endless void at least after death. I hear them whispering, and now I hope that the medication drove me crazy. Because I swear that every night the whispers are clearer and nearer than the previous, and I know I won't live much longer. Jem died on prom night, alone and crumpled in the road, shattered into pieces, while I was convinced he'd stood me up. The person who hit him swiped the ring he was going to propose to me with. We're burying what we could find. I was told at his funeral. That's what his mom told me. Instead of his body, she buried his tux and shoes. We didn't have the luxury of having a body. There was no body. Jem's mom hid her agony with wide smiles and swollen eyes. "It's okay, we can bury his clothes." She said that's what he would have wanted. I know Jem, and he would have wanted to be cremated, burned to ashes. Jem hated the idea of being buried underground to rot away into nothing. He once told me if he were to ever die young, he wanted his ashes sprinkled in the sea, so he could go to Atlantis. That's what loved about him. He was a fantasy freak. His mother's words stuck with me heavily, like a fucking weight on my chest. She did her best to comfort me at the funeral, but I couldn't stand the idea of burying an empty coffin. We're burying what they can find, sweetheart, and some of his clothes. They couldn't find anything. Jem was dead and gone, and whatever pieces of him left were lost. Most of him was caught around the car wheel. Apparently, the crime scene was grisly. Blood on the road, a cruel scarlet smear stretching right across the sidewalk. Excuse me for my language, but the evil bastard who hit him didn't even care. He swiped the ring Jem was going to propose to me with, and left him dead on the side of the road like he didn't fucking matter. Grief is weird. It hits you in waves, and emotions no longer feel like your own. I laugh, and it doesn't feel right. I cry, and it feels forced. It's like being an alien among humans. I thought I was okay, and then I was hearing his favorite song. Smelling his cologne was still clinging to my clothes and my car seats, even my own skin. Then I was breaking apart all over again, overwhelmed, fucking suffocated with him, until I couldn't breathe. I wanted to stay with him, even if he was 6 feet under the ground, buried in dirt and surrounded by wilting flowers. It wasn't fair that I was alive, and he wasn't. Every day I was numb, and I was sick of numb. Every day had no sound. Every day was like living in a forwarding videotape, and I was the only one awake, alive. 2 months after Jem's death, sound bled back in the form of a loud squawk. I was walking back from school a few days ago. I don't know what day it was, I didn't care. Lifting my head, a crow swooped above me. I admit I was mesmerized, smiling a little. I think that was the first time I actually felt something. But then I glimpsed what was caught between its talons. Scarlet entrails twisted in burned strips of clothing I recognized. What was never recovered. What his mother was still looking for. Something snapped inside me, my legs giving way. Jem's tux, the one he died wearing. Another crow flew past, its beak twitching, beady eyes focused. This time my boyfriend's mutilated torso was clinging between tiny talons. I thought I was going to throw up. My first thought was they were hungry. But it didn't matter because they accomplished what the police couldn't. The crows found him. Before I could stop myself, I threw myself into a run. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I had to know what was left of him. And how much of him. And if I would be able to scoop up his lost pieces and take him home. The crows touched down deep in the town forest. I thought it was a nest, or worse, maybe they were eating him. But to my shock, there were bodies, all of them dead kids, and among them my boyfriend, lying in pieces half fused together, his head attached to his torso. The crows worked effortlessly, hopping across the ground, piecing Jem together like a puzzle. I watched, baffled. These kids weren't recently dead. They died a while ago. Serena drowned last fall. Rowan crashed his car 2 years ago. It started to hit me slowly in waves of ice-cold water, that the crows didn't find the other dead kids. When one crow pecked at Rowan's torso, pulling out stringy intestines, his body jerking just like Jem's, I slammed my hand over my mouth. The crows dug them up, which means these birds actively searched for them, wanted them specifically. Serena's face was half rotted away, maggots creeping from her nostrils. The crows rolled her over, chirping to each other like giving each other orders. Rowan was more skeletal than human, and yet I watched, transfixed, as fleshy patches of feather-like skin spread across the pearly white of his skull, covering his half-mutilated grimace. When they were finished with the other two, their focus went to Jem. He took a while, so long that my legs were aching from staying crouched, my clammy hand glued to my mouth. When they were finished, the crows left in a flock, taking off into the sky. They had buried Serena and Rowan in shallow graves covered in flowers and berries. I could be mistaken, but I think it was their own version of a funeral. Jem, however, lay on his back. Somehow, despite the grisly way he had been put back together, he was still beautiful. I thought I was never going to see him again, and there he was, put together like a puzzle piece. I noticed he was missing an arm, and a quiet chirp startled me. Next to me, a baby crow was dragging his mutilated arm, and with perfect precision reattached it, hopping across my boyfriend's stomach. It flew off when I got too close, struggling to hold myself together. I dropped to my knees in front of him, tears choking my throat. I could take all of him back to his mother. I could bury him whole. I scooped him up, but when he twitched in my arms, I dropped him. "Jem?" I whispered, my trembling hands cradling his face, his flickering eyes, lips parting in a silent cry. He didn't move, his head slumping, but his chest was twitching. He was alive. When I rolled him onto his back, something slimy filled my throat. Something was writhing under his skin, raven black streaks running up and down his naked spine. His body twisted and jerked, his head snapping back, congealed blood seeping from his mouth in black lumps. I shuffled back when his spine broke through skin, splitting in two, bulging feathered appendages protruding from his back. Wings. He was beautiful, and yet when Jem turned to me, vacant eyes, beady, almost bird-like, I found myself stepping back. The glamour over my eyes seemed to come apart, and I saw the reality of him, a human twisted and cruelly contorted into something inhuman. His head twitched, dead eyes staring straight through me. I think he was trying to speak, the way his lips parted slowly, but I don't think he could. Behind him, a single crow watched him, its head inclined, almost like it was waiting for something. I screamed at it, told it to shoo, but the bird just sat there staring at me. It wasn't frightened or intimidated. It's almost like it was playing its own fucked-up games with me, pushing me to rush at it or try and attack the thing. Jem didn't react when I said his name. I don't think he even knows his name. Instead, he turned, spread his wings, and took off into the night. After a moment of the crow watching me again like it wanted me to do something, its tiny eyes flicked to a pebble and I felt it. A sudden, overwhelming urge to grab the rock and throw it at its head. But I didn't. And like it was disappointed, it too swooped into the air, giving me last one caw. Days later, I was woken by ice-cold air. My window was open, and on my pillow next to me, something was wet. My forehead was sticky, strands of my hair glued to my cheeks. There was a decapitated head neatly placed on my pillow. Its eyes were wide open like they were still screaming. Next to it was my ring. The following night, I woke to coins being dropped on my pillow. Then maggots, human arms and legs. I think he's giving me gifts, but I'm fucking terrified of him and what he's turned into. If I shut my window, he comes through the front door. He won't stop. I've told the authorities, but they're convinced it's some kind of animal. I led the sheriff back to the forest where I found the bodies of the other kids, but they're gone. I'm terrified the same thing that happened to Jem, whatever creature he became, is happening to them too. I keep hearing noises at night, loud chirping and flapping wings, like they're outside my house hunting me down. It sounds like they're teasing me, waiting for the right moment. I can hear a mix of human laughter, laced with something wrong, bird-like. They're outside right now, laughing. They won't stop laughing, giggling, chittering in their own language, and sometimes I swear the birds answer. They swoop past my window, slamming their talon-like nails on the glass. I tried locking and bordering it up, but they just tore it down. Please help me. How do I get Jem to stop? Is there a way to stop them? Whatever my boyfriend has turned into is trying to fucking kill me. Just a little further, Danny. We're almost there. I reassured my younger sister as I tried my hardest to roll her difficult-to-maneuver wheelchair up the steep hill path. Unfortunately, the wheels kept getting lodged in potholes and caught on branches sticking out of the dirt. "Lana," she said weakly, "we don't have to sit at the peak. We can just have our picnic right here. Don't worry about it." Before she let out a brutal cough and clutched her chest. Danny. Oh, Danny. Too benign for this world for her own good, and maybe that's why it's taking her away from me. Just looking down at her weak, sickly, pale 10-year-old form that's still reeling from the needles and IV tubes that had been strapped up to her for weeks, I can feel myself choke up. She used to be so lively, so energetic, so feisty you'd have to tie her to a leash to keep her in one spot. But now look at her. In the span of only 1 year, this cruel and unforgiving disease has stripped her of her very essence. Now she can barely stand, and with each word she manages to squeak out, she feels aching pain, as her lungs feel like they're being filled with glass shards. But she's held on. She's a fighter, always has been, as well as an optimist. She says as soon as she's all better again, she's going to become a doctor and research a cure to beat this disease's butt. But I'm not like her. I'm weak. I don't stand for anything, and I always assume the worst. That's why I know that her aspirations will never come to fruition. I know she's not beating this disease. despite how much I cheer and root for her on the sidelines. I knew it from the doctor's grim expression and the preceding uncontrollable sobbing from my parents after he privately delivered news to them. I knew it the moment the hospital let her go home with us that she didn't have long. The hill we were walking was one me and her raced up and down countless times when we were younger. We were so blessed to have moved near it when our dad got a promotion at work and had to relocate. A hill in the middle of an acre of sunflowers fit with daisies and a big apple tree at the summit, a sight you'd think to only find in a Disney movie, was just a field away from us. A paradise that belonged to us and only us. Our little getaway to run to when life got stressful. We were especially lucky to have gone out today as the clouds had cleared, and the sun seemed to take a liking to us as it showered us in its rays. Despite that, my sister still shivered. An invisible draft absorbed her of all possible warmth she could be feeling in that moment. A chill that was ever present in her soul, as its grip on life loosened with each day. A chill no amount of weighted blankets or heaters could dispel. But I had to try. "Do you need your blanket, Danny?" I asked, fishing my hand into the backpack I was carrying. No, I'm fine. Honestly, I'd probably just feel colder if I did have it," she answered, still quivering. Are you sure? I just don't want you to be cold." My voice began to crack at the seams as I began to lose my composure. "Lana, I'm fine, really," she said in the best nerves-easing voice she could muster. But I saw right through her act. I knew she was in so much pain and discomfort that unfortunately no amount of medication and words of pity could fix. It was brave of her to hide such anguish, so I just bit my tongue and stared off into the distance as I gave up attempting to wheel her up the impossible to surmount hill. The serenity and peacefulness that surrounded us that would usually be calming for me instead felt like it was drowning me in its silence. It's hard to explain. I suppose that the knowledge that my sister was feeling none of this peace as a war between her antibodies and the invading cancer cells waged on in her bloodstream was enough to make me feel as if I had no right to enjoy the tranquility. Yet here it was trying to force me to. As I gazed across the vast landscape of perky flowers that stared at me with their hazel irises, while a slight breeze tickled their petals, and as hopelessness began to settle within my soul, something caught my eye. A horse, dark, inky, a small black smudge on an otherwise magnificent painting, inlaid a tall black horse. Despite being miles away, it was hard to ignore as it stood out of place amongst the amber petals that surrounded it. It was a true eyesore, an eyesore that strangely filled me with a bottomless pit of dread as I began feeling queasy at the sight of its stationary form. "Hey, Danny, you see that horse?" I asked my sister as I delicately spun her wheelchair around to face the horse's direction. Her eyes narrowed as she attempted to spot the sable stallion. "What horse?" I glanced back up and was just about to point to its location when I noticed that the horse had vanished. I let out a sigh of disappointment. It must have run away. My bad, Danny. If I see it again, I'll try to point it out quicker." She nodded her beanie-covered head. "Okay, can we have our lunch now? I'm really hungry." "Sure thing. Let me just find a good spot." Upon finding a suitable patch of grass to have our lunch on, I took out a red-checkered picnic blanket and laid it flat on the ground. I wheeled my sister over and carefully helped her out of her chair onto the blanket before we set out a loaf of soft bread and ingredients. We were sat near a slope leading down into an acre of sunflowers, a slope that me and her used to playfully roll down back when she was healthy. "Did you bring any jam?" "I can't seem to find any," Danny asked meekly as she searched my backpack. It was then I realized I had completely forgotten the jam. It must have slipped my mind while packing as my thoughts were mostly preoccupied with what Danny needed for the trip. "Oh damn, I'm sorry, Danny, I forgot. I'm really sorry," I said in an embarrassed tone. A leak of sympathy in my stomach that had been dripping with beads of pity developed into a catastrophic flood of guilt that steadily filled my interior as I choked out further apologies. A mistake that would seem so minor to others felt like a rock crushing down on my ribcage. I brought Danny on this trip to make her feel more at ease with her rapidly worsening condition, and yet I couldn't even roll her up a simple slope or merely remember to bring jam. "It's okay, Lana. At least you brought butter. I like butter nearly as much as jam," she reassured me as she pulled out a tub of butter and peeled the lid open. She took hold of a butter knife in her pale hands and slid it across the block before spreading it out on a piece of bread. I could tell even this was tiring for her, but I stayed quiet as she clearly wanted to do it herself with no assistance. Rustle. I heard the rustling of flowers behind me as I shifted around and looked down into the jungle of blossoms while my sister continued her efforts in crafting a sandwich. Even from my higher view, I couldn't see what was making the sound thanks to the overwhelming amount of sunflowers. But I could hear it. I could smell it. The smell of rot and slurry assaulted my nostrils as the rustling of florets grew closer. It was not just that I heard, as I also heard the ragged, exhausted heaving of an animal accompany it. Even as the sounds grew closer and closer and I noticed flowers fall out of view with each crunch of their stem, I could still not spot the animal which was making those noises, despite how close they sounded below. The stench only assaulted my senses further as it became more potent with each second that passed. I could almost make out another sound before my sister snapped me back to reality, and I shifted to meet her curious gaze. "Sis, you okay?" she asked, holding a sandwich of her own making as the movement suddenly ceased and the smell evaporated. Yeah, did you hear that rustling?" I asked worryingly. She looked at me puzzled. "No, I didn't hear any rustling. Oh, but did you smell that lovely scent that filled the air? Smelled sorta like roses and marshmallows, you know. I haven't smelt those in a long time," she answered cheerfully, just before she chowed down on the soft exterior of her sandwich. She looked different. I realized the reason she looked so unfamiliar to me was because of how lively she appeared. Her face was fatter and fuller of color as a dimpled smile had risen across it. It had been so long since I saw my sister with a grin that I forgot all about the rustling and the stench, and instead focused on chatting with her while she had a bit of energy. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I said as I begun to prep my own sandwich. "It's always beautiful here. Gosh, I'm so glad we came. I've missed this place," she stated as she chewed away. "That's true. I guess I just forgot how much this place was like a slice of heaven since it has been a while since I came here. About a year, I think, since you began staying at the hospital." She stopped mid-bite and looked at me. "You haven't been here in a year? Why?" My eyes fell to the ground as I pondered the question in my head, although I found the answer in my heart. I guess I just couldn't go here without you. I mean, it's our special place, right? We did everything here together. Tag camping, sunflower picking. It just felt wrong to visit with you not by my side." She stared at me with fond eyes as she visibly reminisced back to those days. "Huh. Remember when we went frolicking through the flowers and—" I cut her off, already knowing what she was going to say. And I fell into a deep puddle. Yeah, I remember it well, especially how cold it was. She let out a little giggle, her face blooming with glee. I don't know why I found it so funny at the time. Even now, just thinking about it, I can barely hold back laughter. I remember you on your back, cackling to yourself as I lifted myself out. I was wearing my favorite shirt at the time, too. I mean, what the heck was a hole that deep doing in the middle of a sunflower field? I said, unable to stop myself from cracking a smile as Danny chuckled even harder. Soon I found myself laughing alongside her. When our laughter quelled, Danny's face took a more relieved expression as she looked at me. I haven't seen you smile in a long time. This caught me off guard. She was right, of course, but I thought I did a good enough job at hiding my despair when I spent time with her as to not make her feel even more worse, as not to make her feel like it was her fault for my sadness. Before I could say anything in response, she got to her feet, catching me off guard a second time. She looked at me with a toothy grin. "You know what, Lana?" "What?" I said, still in awe. "Maybe we should see the hilltop. I mean, I'm feeling a lot better at the moment, and I think seeing the apple tree before going home would make us both feel a lot more happier." Before I could say anything or object, Danny began jogging uphill in excitement. I didn't have much time to discuss with her whether she should be doing that sort of stuff, especially as the doctor had recommended that she would need assistance if she ever wanted to walk. But by the time I got to my feet, she was nearly out of view. Before leaving to follow her, I took one more glance back at where I heard those sounds. I attempted to decipher the faint one I had heard right before my attention was torn away from it by Danny. Now that I thought about it, it sounded an awful lot like the clacking of hooves. "Whoa, Danny, don't leave me behind now," I said, exhausted from how difficult it was to keep up with her. She looked back at me with a mischievous smile. "Heh, come on now, Lana, you're only 5 years older than me. Don't tell me you've gotten old and slow," she said in a playfully smug tone as she kept her quick pace. I gestured to an invisible walking stick and hunched my back forward as I began to wave my fist at her. "Darn it, get back here, you meddling kid. This is my property and you will obey its laws." I shouted in an old man voice, mimicking a neighbor of ours called Mr. Wellers, who was a real stickler about his lawn. This got a laugh out of Danny as she slowed her pace down to meet mine's. All right, I'll slow down. Wouldn't want you to break your back," she replied, playing along. We both shared a laugh as we walked side by side, nearing the hilltop as we strolled past daisies that seemed to bloom due to our presence. Or maybe it was just hers as her form glowed from the golden light casting down from the sky. As I watched her frolic up the dirt path and chat with me about topics in which she had struggled to express to me in that depressing gray hospital room months ago, a weight of hopelessness lifted from my soul and was instead replaced with a more soothing sensation. Hope. Hope that this was a sign that she had begun a journey of recovery, that the bad days were over and that the future was as bright and blue-skied as today, that me and her could return to this hill as frequently as we did back when we were younger, that I'd have more time with my sister. We soon reached the hilltop and thus the apple tree. It hadn't changed one bit from the last time we visited, still towering over us and being plentiful of red, juicy apples. "Wow," my sister said as she gazed up at the bushy-leaved hair of the tree. She pointed up at an apple that grew from a branch fairly close to the ground, but was still just out of reach for both of us. "Lana, if you let me climb on your shoulders, I'm sure I can reach that apple." I thought it over for a second, but ultimately decided it would be a good last action to end this trip on. Sure, why not? I wandered over to where she stood and buckled my knees so she could reach my shoulders and grapple around them. I stumbled a bit once she eventually jumped on my back, not expecting her to weigh as much as she did, as when I was helping her out her wheelchair an hour ago, her body had felt like a bag of twigs. I stood firmly in place, trying my best not to sway as my sister extended her hand up to the prized apple, when that familiar horrid stench hit me. "Oh wow, it smells so good. Just like roses," my sister stated above me as she continued trying to get a good grasp of the apple. Meanwhile, I frantically looked around to spot where this smell was coming from. It was just as Danny finally managed to pluck the apple from the branch that a noise came from behind the tree. A neigh. A loud, gurgled one. A breathless, bubbly neigh that startled me so badly it knocked me off balance and I nearly tumbled to the ground with Danny still on my shoulders. Luckily, I managed to regain balance and have Danny dismount my back as the animal made its way from behind the stump and within our view. The stench became unbearable, tugging at my gag reflex with a crooked hook as a black horse trotted into view. Chunky blood, pus, vomit, and other fluids dripped from every open pore on its body, from natural pores to opened wounds. Its eyes had a glossy look, and its mane dripped with grease as it heaved in and out, its exposed windpipe undulating with each choked breath. It took all my power and some physical restraint not to vomit up all my insides right then and there, from the grotesque sight that stood towering over me and Danny. Its silk, rotting skin would shift with each gallop, sliding up and down its muscles as its hooves shook from the lack of meat on them. Yet it managed to stand as it steadily approached us, neighing. Dread attacked my nerves with ferocity as I retreated back in fear. But Danny did not have the same reaction as me. In fact, she had quite the opposite. "Wow, so pretty," she said, approaching the stallion with zero apprehension or disgust, but rather admiration. The horse continued to close in on her, with Danny lifting her hand to meet its muzzle. "Danny, get away from that thing," I shouted at her, pleading with her to back away from this beast as I felt nothing good could come with interacting with it. But she ignored me as she awaited to meet the horse's touch. I would have tried to run and carry her away from the horse, but terror had shackled me to where I stood as my knees locked in place. I couldn't bear watch as the horse's head bobbed mere inches away from Danny's palm. What was Danny seeing that I couldn't? Being weak, I clenched my eyes shut and I prayed this was some sort of nightmare that I would wake up from. But a part of me also wished it wasn't, because if it was, that meant Danny hadn't actually begun recovering, and that when I woke up, I'd find her sickly form in bed attached to wires as she groaned in pain. Hey, good girl," I heard my sister giggle as I squished my eyelids together. Hazardously, I reopened them to view a strange sight. Danny was petting the horse's muzzle, much to the horse's visible delight as it lowered its head to make it easier for Danny to stroke its snout. I stared on in confusion, still unable to move from where I stood as Danny continued giggling while grooming the vile mare. I noticed that, with each caress Danny gifted the horse's revolting muzzle, no dirt or mucus would coat her hand afterwards. Then I soon noticed that Danny looked different again, a change that was hard not to notice. Her beanie had fallen off, but instead of showcasing a shaved head, it instead showcased a veil of curly, dirty blonde hair hanging from her crown, seemingly having regrew while I had shut my eyes. That's when I got a sense of what was happening. That's when I knew what the horse was. I think Danny knew too, as she had a somber expression on her face as the horse shifted its height lower to the ground, until Danny was able to mount its back. Tears began to brim from my eyes as realization struck me like lighting on a thunderous night. No. No, I yelled as Danny climbed onto the back of the horse and it regrew to its original scale. Please don't take her. Not yet, please, just give us more time, just more time, I shouted desperately, pleading with an uncaring force of nature to delay the inevitable, just so I can spend more time with my sister, so I could have more time to say goodbye. The horse just neighed in response to my begging, uncaring or rather unbiased, as it most likely hears the same pleads all the time. Instead, it was Danny who replied, "I'm so sorry, Lana. I wish I could stay, I really do. I don't want to leave you, Mommy and Daddy. I don't want to go. But it's not my choice," she said, tears streaming down her face just as they did mine. "Just know that I'm okay with this. I'm just so happy I got to frolic around with you, one last time. Danny..." My voice cracked as I found it impossible to speak from the tears that were flooding my throat. "Bye, sis, for now at least." The horse neighed and began to gallop down the side of the hill, keeping its balance perfectly as it descended the steep inclines, past the daisies, past the wheelchair, past the picnic blanket, and soon into the sunflower field as the sun plummeted. All the while my sister clung to its back, and then my sister was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bunk, staring at my arm, clenching and unclenching my fist, waiting for that wrongness to resurface. It never did, but I felt it, like someone standing just outside your vision, watching, waiting. By morning, I convinced myself it was exhaustion trauma. Maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing, oxygen deprivation, nitrogen narcosis. The others were already treating me like I'd barely scraped through a ghost story, except for Kristen. She was quiet at breakfast, picking at her food. When I sat down, she glanced at my arm. "You remember anything?" she asked, voice low. I hesitated. "Not much." She nodded, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. "They pulled you up with the bell, but we lost your umbilical. That stopped me." "What?" "It was severed." I looked down at my plate, but I wasn't seeing it. My umbilical cord, my lifeline, had been cut. That meant I hadn't been connected when they brought me back. That wasn't possible. I should have drowned. I should have died down there, but I didn't, because something else sent me back. That night I dreamt of the deep. I was sinking, the cold wrapping around me, pulling me down. My arm throbbed, the wrongness seeping deeper into my bones. And then, a shape in the dark. Not a fish, not a person. Something older, a presence that didn't swim. It shifted as if the water obeyed it. It didn't speak with words, it didn't need to. The deal wasn't a bargain, it was an exchange. "I saved you." Its voice coiled through my skull, a whisper in my own thoughts. "Now you carry me." I tried to scream, but my mouth filled with salt water. I woke up gasping, clutching my arm. My skin was cold, wet, like I'd just crawled out of the ocean. I looked down. A single droplet of black water slid from my wrist to my palm, then vanished. My heart pounded. I didn't come back alone. I became something else, and whatever I brought with me, it's still waiting for what it's owed. Over the next few days, things got worse. At first, it was just sensations. A pull in my gut when I walked past the ship's water tanks. A shiver down my spine when I heard waves lapping against the hull. Then came the visions. When I looked at the ocean, I didn't just see the surface anymore. I saw depths, shapes moving in the black. A city of impossible structures shifting in ways that hurt to comprehend. And at its center, a door. Something behind it waiting, and I was the key. I started hearing voices when I slept. Not just the one from before, others. Whispers carried through currents, pleading, sobbing, laughing in tones that didn't belong to human throats. I wasn't just carrying something, I was delivering something. And it was hungry. Then the first accident happened. A new diver, Lewis, went overboard during a routine equipment check. 1 second he was there, harness clipped, radio check clear. The next, gone, no splash, no struggle, just missing. They searched for hours, no sign, no body. That night I dreamed of him. He was floating in that impossible city, staring at me. His eyes were black. "You brought me here." I woke up gasping, my arm ice cold, and on my wrist a new scar, a single curved line, like a tally mark. That's when I understood. The deal wasn't just about saving me. I was its ferryman now, and Lewis was just the first. The late October air was crisp as I hiked the familiar trail along the Minnesota River, a stretch of wilderness south of the Twin Cities. The vibrant reds and golds of the changing leaves clashed with the deepening gray of the twilight sky. The sun, already dipping below the horizon, cast long skeletal shadows across the path. I pulled my sweatshirt tighter, the chill seeping into my bones despite the brisk pace I set. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a deer, standing at the edge of the woods. But something was off. It was massive, easily twice the size of any deer I'd ever seen in these parts. Its silhouette was elongated, almost skeletal, and its posture was strangely upright, almost as if it were standing on two legs. Its head was held at an unnatural angle, the long neck almost serpentine. As it turned its head towards me, I saw its eyes, twin points of burning orange, glowing with an unnatural intensity. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it vanished into the dense undergrowth. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I'd spent countless hours hiking these trails, and I'd never seen anything like it. Was it just a trick of the light? A case of mistaken identity? Or was it something else? The image of those glowing eyes haunted me as I hurried back to my car, the fading light casting an eerie pall over the familiar landscape. Back in my apartment in one of the quiet suburbs south of the city, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, but the image of those burning eyes kept flashing in my mind. Maybe it was just a large deer, its size exaggerated by the shadows and my own fear, but the feeling of unease lingered. I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows repeatedly, a prickle of fear crawling up my spine. The unsettling feeling intensified as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. During my walks along the river trails, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Broken branches high in the trees, tracks too large to belong to any known animal, a strange musky odor like rotting meat mixed with something sweet and cloying that clung to the air like a shroud. The dreams began, vivid nightmares of the deer, its form twisting and contorting in the shadows, growing larger, more monstrous until it resembled something not quite animal, not quite human. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced I wasn't alone in my apartment. One evening, as I was walking back from the grocery store, the streetlights flickered off. I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the parking lot, partially obscured by the shadows, but its form was unmistakable. Tall and skeletal, with dark matted fur and what looked like antlers protruding from its head, its eyes, those burning orange eyes, were fixed on me, radiating a malevolence that chilled me to the bone. It stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from bone and shadow, its gaze unwavering. I froze, a wave of pure terror washing over me. My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like lead and my throat felt constricted. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, its gaze unwavering, before the lights turning on revealing an empty spot. The fear became a constant companion. I started carrying a heavy walking stick on my hikes, a pathetic defense against whatever this creature was. I researched local wildlife, trying to find a rational explanation, but nothing fit. I even considered talking to someone about it, but the fear of being dismissed as crazy kept me silent. The isolation only fueled my paranoia. Driven by a desperate need to protect myself, I went to a local gun shop and bought a used handgun. It was a small something I could easily conceal. The cold steel of it felt heavy and reassuring in my trembling hand, a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Winter arrived, blanketing the landscape in snow. The cold seemed to amplify the dread, making the feeling of being watched even more intense. It grew bolder. I started seeing it closer to my apartment building, lurking in the shadows of the parking lot, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was no longer just watching, it was hunting. The tapping started subtly, a light scratching sound I initially dismissed as branches against the window. But it grew more insistent. more deliberate. One night I woke to a tap, tap, tap on my bedroom window. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what it was. Slowly I sat up, my hand trembling as I reached for the handgun on my nightstand. The tapping continued, a rhythmic pulse of dread. I crept towards the window, peering through the blinds. It stood there, its gaunt skeletal form silhouetted against the snowy landscape. Its face, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a mask of grotesque hunger, its long, sharp teeth bared in a silent snarl. Those eyes, burning orange embers, were fixed on me, radiating pure malevolence. Terror seized me, a primal fear I'd never experienced before. My breath hitched in my throat. I raised the handgun, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and aimed at the creature outside the window. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping continued, each tap a hammer blow against my sanity. I squeezed the trigger, the gun roared, the recoil jarring my hand. I flinched, expecting to see it fall, but when I looked back at the window, it was gone. Just an empty window, the snow falling silently outside. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a wave of confusion. Had I actually hit it? Or had it just vanished as it always did? I lowered the gun, my hand still trembling, and turned away from the window. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping was behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. It stood in the corner of my room, its back to the window. How? It hadn't come through the window. It was inside with me. How? The question echoed in my mind, a chilling whisper. Its head slowly turned, those burning eyes locking onto mine. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the building. It was even more terrifying up close. I could see the details now, the matted fur, the long, sharp claws, the patches of bare, rotting flesh. The smell was overpowering, a mix of decay and something ancient, something utterly alien. I raised the gun again, but it was a useless gesture. I knew deep down that no bullet could stop this creature. It was a manifestation of fear and darkness. It took a step towards me, and I knew. I knew this was the end. Its long, clawed hand reached out. I fired again and again. The gun recoiled in my hand, the sound deafening in the small apartment. It shrieked, a sound that tore through the night, a sound of pure, unearthly rage. It staggered back, its burning eyes wide with something that might have been surprise or even pain. It turned and lunged for the window, crashing through the glass and disappearing into the snowy night. I collapsed to the floor, my breath ragged, my body trembling. I didn't know if I'd heard it or if I'd just startled it, but it was gone. For now. I knew I couldn't stay there. It would be back. It was only a matter of time. I scrambled for my coat and keys, shoving them into my pockets along with anything else I could grab: phone, wallet, a half-eaten granola bar, and bolted out the door. I drove through the night, adrenaline coursing through my veins, my eyes constantly scanning the shadows. I ended up in a cheap motel hundreds of miles away, but I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. It was out there somewhere. I could feel its presence, a cold dread that clung to me like a shroud. As I described my encounter in detail, the chilling progression from a fleeting glimpse to a terrifying confrontation. I recounted the creature's appearance, its glowing eyes, its unnatural strength, the way it seemed to invade my thoughts. I warned people to be careful, to stay out of the woods at night, to be aware of the signs. Some people responded with skepticism, dismissing my story as a hallucination or a hoax, but others believed. They shared their own stories, their own encounters with the unexplained. They spoke of strange sightings in the woods, of eerie sounds in the night, of a growing sense of dread that filled the area. I realized I wasn't alone. There were others who had seen it, and whispers about the name, the Wendigo. There's this place in rural Canada that I grew up in. The locals call it Skinwalker Valley because the indigenous community often tells stories about Wendigos and skinwalker encounters in the area. Many non-indigenous people have their own alleged true stories about these encounters as well. It's a strange place. There's a weird vibe to it, tons of ghost stories, UFO sightings, and more. I won't get into all of that, though. I'll just focus on my Wendigo and skinwalker experiences. All of this happened when I was a teenager. My 4 friends and I were packed into a car, headed to a party out in the boonies. On the highway, it's nothing but empty fields of long grass for miles. It was foggy that night, and we were listening to loud music, singing along, laughing, and having a good time. As we went down a hill section of the highway, the fog got even thicker. We saw a large, weird-looking figure moving in the distance. It looked unnatural. My friend who was driving said, "What the hell is that?" And we slowed down, pulling over to the side of the highway to get a better look. The fog was so dense and it was hard to see much, but we could make out what looked like a large black figure with long limbs next to a small body of water. It very clearly had a white animal skull for a head. We all sat there trying to make sense of what we were looking at. Then, our indigenous friend said, "Holy shit, that's a Wendigo. Drive." We quickly peeled off, and he asked to be dropped off at home after that, visibly shaken. The second encounter happened at one of the parties. It was right in the valley alongside the lake that ran through it. We had a bonfire going, music, beer, everything was normal. Then suddenly, we heard a loud, blood-curdling scream that sounded like it came from a woman. We turned down the music, listening for a moment, worried that someone might need help. As we sat in silence, we heard it again. You could hear people whispering, "What the FK?" And a group of us decided to check it out. We followed the sound toward the lake, and on the other side could make out what looked like a woman with long, dark hair sitting by the water. A few of us called out, asking if she needed help, but she didn't respond. She just continued to scream and sob. Nobody knew what to do, and since she wasn't communicating with us, we decided to head back to the party. Nobody wanted to call the cops because we didn't want them to bust us for underage drinking. The next day, we decided to go check out the area where she had been. When we got there, we found a mutilated deer carcass, swarming with flies, exactly where she had been sitting the night before. That place still gives me chills. I fully believe the legend of skinwalkers and wendigos after what I saw and heard about out there. It was my third week living in a small town called Guardala. It wasn't even an option. The company I worked for had just opened a unit in that town, and as one of the senior employees, I was assigned to oversee the opening process. I was required to stay there for 3 to 4 months. Guardala wasn't a bad place. As a matter of fact, it was one of the quietest and most beautiful small towns I had ever been to. I enjoyed the peacefulness, the chirping sounds of birds, the flowing water in the river, and the rustling of trees swayed by the wind. The apartment my company rented for me was about a 15-minute train ride away or a 45-minute trip by bus. So when I had to work overtime until nearly midnight that day, and there were no buses available, the only option left to go home was by train. I stood on the train station platform, raised my hand to check the time on my wristwatch, and wondered when the next train would arrive. It was 11:45 p.m., and I still saw a few people standing there waiting for the last train. Then, a few minutes later, precisely at 11:50 p.m., I saw an oncoming train entering the station. There it is, I thought. The train stopped and opened its doors. I looked around. There were about 5 or 6 other people, but no one seemed to move. I was the only one who stepped inside. One of the ladies standing just a few meters from me looked startled when she saw me board the train. "Isn't this supposed to be the last train?" I wondered as I took a seat. The train car I was in wasn't full, which made sense since it was nearly midnight. But it was at least half occupied, which seemed odd for this late hour. As I waited for the train to arrive at my station, I pulled out my phone to check if I had any messages from friends, family, or colleagues. There was one. It was from Caleb. Caleb was my coworker. He was a local and had also worked overtime with me that night, but his place was just around the corner from the office. "Hey man," Caleb said in his text. "I don't know if anyone has ever told you this, but I guess it's better to tell you regardless. I forgot to mention it back at the office. The last train in this town is precisely at 12 o'clock midnight," Caleb continued. "The previous one is at 11:15 p.m. So if you ever see a train arriving between 11:15 and 12 a.m., do not board it." The message was sent at 11:10 p.m., right when I had just left the office. "Why?" I asked. Caleb replied quickly, "Let's just say there's an urban legend about it that's been around for generations. No one boards a train that arrives between 11:15 and 12:00. Do not get on." Was that why the lady at the platform seemed startled when she saw me board? "But why? It's just a train," I texted back. I mean, I can just get off at the next station if it takes me the wrong way." "Why do you sound like you're already inside the train?" he asked. "I am," I replied. "The train arrived at 11:50 p.m. and I hopped in. It's already departed." It took him a while to respond, then he replied with only one word. "Shit." "Okay, that was odd." "Care to explain, Caleb?" I typed. But before I could send the message, my phone lost signal. No texts, no calls, no internet, nothing. Weird. I looked out the window and noticed something strange. I had taken this train countless times, but never once had I seen mountains through the windows. Guardala was a beach town. It didn't even have a single mountain. I had no idea where the train was headed, but it didn't seem like I had any other options. So I remained seated. I looked out the window again and saw a tunnel ahead. Within minutes, the train entered. Pitch darkness. Apart from the dim lighting inside the train, there was nothing, no lights, no signs. Then I felt the train slowing down. Slowly, slowly, until I saw the light ahead at the end of the tunnel. I didn't know why, but I had a bad feeling. The moment the train exited the tunnel, I immediately saw a train station. That should have been a good thing. But something about the station looked eerie. Wrong. The station's walls, pillars, and ceilings were decorated with jagged rocks, as if it had been built inside a cave. The train slowed down more and more until it eventually stopped. I looked out the window. There were people standing on the platform as if they were waiting to board. The moment the train stopped and the doors opened, an earthquake suddenly struck. The station's walls and floor cracked open, and from those cracks flames burst out. The station turned scorching hot. It felt like hell. The passengers inside the train erupted in chilling cries. They screamed in horror, realizing what was about to befall them. Then, just seconds after the flames burst from the cracks, the people standing on the platform transformed. They became monstrous, 3 meters tall with red skin and golden horns protruding from their heads. Demons. The passengers screamed even louder. 3 demons stood in front of my train car. Each one smashed a window, grabbed a passenger by the head, yanked them through the broken glass, and hurled them into the fiery cracks. I watched as the passengers struggled, trying to claw their way out of the flames. Their screams of agony echoed through the station. But one of the demons walked up and shoved their heads deeper into the fire. In seconds, they were gone. Consumed by fear, I instinctively ran out the train's door and past the demons, who were too busy grabbing and throwing people into the flaming cracks to notice me. I had no idea what lay beyond the platform full of enraged demons, but staying there wasn't an option. So I ran, through the station of hell. The next chamber I entered was even worse. People were being punched to pieces by the same kind of demons I'd seen earlier. But they didn't die. Seconds after being torn apart, their bodies regenerated, only to be shattered again, over and over. Was there any way out of this hellish place, anything at all? I didn't stop running despite witnessing countless forms of human torture around me. Strangely, none of the demons seemed to pay attention to me. Or so I thought. Then, without warning, a giant red hand grabbed me by the torso. It was one of the demons. This is the end of me, I thought. The demon lifted me to its eye level, staring intently, as if trying to observe me. I braced myself, expecting it to bite my head off. Instead, it let out a deafening growl right in my face. It growled so loud, so close, it felt like my eardrums were about to explode. Then, unexpectedly, the demon raised its arm, me still in its grasp, and hurled me back toward the train platform. I crashed into the jagged ceiling before plummeting hard to the ground. Pain shot through my entire body. It felt like some of my bones were fractured, if not already broken. But I forced myself up, thinking of trying to run past the demon, hoping for another way out. It growled again. Then it charged at me. What choice did I have? None. I turned and ran back to the train. It was still there, its door open. I sprinted as fast as my battered body allowed, diving inside just as the demon reached the threshold. But it didn't follow me in. It stopped right outside the train's door. It didn't try to step in. It didn't even try to reach for me. It just stood there, silently. I took a look around. The car was empty. No one else was there. All of the passengers had been thrown into the fiery cracks. All of them. No one was left. No one but me. Yet none of the demons tried to take me. Not a single one. From the next train car, I heard the same blood-curdling screams. It was happening there, too. When the demons were done, silence fell. Then, as if nothing had happened, the demons transformed back into human forms. All the cracks were reversed and disappeared. The fire was gone. The train station's platform returned to normal. Seconds later, the train doors closed, and the train departed. I was alive. But what the hell was that? I stayed in my seat, waiting for the train to stop at the next station. I didn't know where it would take me, but it could be worse than the last one. Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the train arrived at another station. It looked familiar. It was the station near my office. The very place where I had boarded the cursed train. As soon as the doors opened, I wasted no time. I leaped onto the platform. The moment I stepped off, the train pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. I looked around. No one was there. I remembered a large digital clock hanging near the platform. 12:01 a.m. Everything I had just experienced had lasted only 11 minutes, but it felt like forever. Then my phone vibrated. The signal had returned. It was a message from Caleb. "Well, I can't really tell you for sure where that train goes," he wrote. "I honestly don't know. The legend has been around for generations. Some of our great-grandparents accidentally boarded it, and thankfully returned to tell the story. They said the train took them to hell, or something like it. But that was generations ago," he continued. "We all know there shouldn't be any trains between 11:15 and 12:00, so no one dares to board one, even if they see it. I've seen it a few times," he admitted, "but I never got on and I never planned to." I thought that was his last message. But then another one came. "So I don't know if the train actually goes to hell or not." I tapped the reply button on my chat app and responded to Caleb. "It does." The first time I saw one of them, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been working on my laptop for hours, the only light in the room coming from the blue glow of the screen. I was about to close it when I glanced toward the window and saw it. A figure. It was standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment, just beyond the edge of the streetlight. Its body was shadowy and indistinct, but its face was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not the kind you'd give a stranger in passing. This smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp, like its mouth had been stretched beyond its limits. I stared at it, my heart pounding. For a moment I thought it might be a person, a prank maybe. But the longer I looked, the more I realized there was something unnatural about the way it stood, the way it stared at me without blinking. I closed the laptop and pulled the curtains shut, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the image of that smile stayed with me. The next day I convinced myself it had been a dream. I told no one. What was there to say? That I'd seen a shadowy figure with a creepy smile standing outside my window? People would laugh or worse, think I was losing it. I went about my day trying to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the grocery store, I kept glancing over my shoulder. On the bus ride home, I felt a pair of unseen eyes boring into the back of my head. That night, as I sat in my living room watching TV, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. I froze. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something standing on the other side of the glass. Slowly, I stood and approached the window, my breath shallow. I reached for the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just enough to peek outside. It was there. The same figure from the night before, its face pressed against the glass, its grin impossibly wide. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, it was gone. Over the next few days, the figures started appearing everywhere. At first, it was just one or two, standing at the edge of my vision, on the sidewalk across the street, in the corner of a crowded cafe, reflected in the glass of a shop window. But soon they began to multiply. They stood in groups now, always watching, their grins frozen in place. They never moved, never spoke, but their presence was suffocating. I couldn't escape them. They were outside my apartment when I left for work, standing silently in the alley as I hurried past. I saw them on the subway, their smiling faces visible through the windows as the train pulled into the station. Even at work, they found me. I'd glance up from my desk and see one of them standing in the parking lot, its head tilted as though it were studying me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was hallucinating. but no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they wouldn't go away. The first dream came on the fifth night. I was standing in an empty field, the sky a deep, unnatural red. The air was thick and heavy, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. The figures surrounded me, their smiles glowing in the dim light. They didn't move or speak, but I could feel their eyes on me, their gaze like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. One of them stepped forward, its grin widening until it split its face in two. Its mouth opened, revealing row upon row of jagged teeth. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. I woke up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. But the worst part wasn't the dream. The worst part was the figure standing at the foot of my bed, its smile gleaming in the darkness. I stopped leaving my apartment after that. The figures were everywhere now. Outside my window, in the hallway, reflected in every mirror and screen. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel their smiles, burned into the back of my mind. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. Every time I tried to call for help, the line would go dead, the faint sound of distant laughter crackling through the receiver. I tried confronting them once. I stood at the window and screamed at the figure standing on the sidewalk. "What do you want from me?" It didn't respond, it just tilted its head, its grin stretching impossibly wide, and then it took a step closer. It wasn't until the 12th day that I understood why they were watching me. I was staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind, when I noticed something. My smile. It was wrong, too wide, too sharp. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was becoming one of them. The whispers in the back of my mind, the growing hunger, the way my face felt stretched and unnatural, it all made sense now. They weren't watching me. They were waiting for me. I fought it at first, clinging to what little humanity I had left. But the change was inevitable. My reflection no longer matched my memories. My eyes were too bright, my grin permanently etched into my face. Even my voice had changed, taking on a hollow, echoing quality that didn't feel like my own. The figures didn't stand outside anymore. They were inside my apartment, surrounding me, their smiles no longer menacing but welcoming. I could hear their whispers now, soft and inviting. "Join us. You've always been one of us." And deep down, I knew they were right. The final step came when I stopped resisting. The fear melted away, replaced by a strange, euphoric calm. My smile widened, my body dissolving into shadow until I stood among them, my grin as wide and sharp as theirs. I didn't know how much time had passed. Days, weeks, time had become meaningless. I stopped recognizing myself, not just in the mirror but in my thoughts, my actions. The smiling monsters didn't need to force me to join them. My resistance was crumbling all on its own. I began to feel connected to them. It started as a faint hum in the back of my mind, like static. Over time, it grew louder, clearer, until I could almost understand it, a language made of whispers and emotions of hunger and patience. When I looked at the figures surrounding me, I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt kinship. And that terrified me. I decided to run. It wasn't rational. I didn't even know where I could go. But sitting in that apartment, surrounded by their grins, waiting for the inevitable, was worse than death. So I packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. They didn't stop me. In fact, they didn't react at all. As I stepped out into the cold, empty street, they simply watched, their smiles frozen, their heads tilting ever so slightly as if to say, "Go ahead, see if it matters." I walked for hours, my feet aching, my breath clouding in the freezing air. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not until I was far, far away from them. But no matter how far I went, they were always there. I reached a small town just as the sun began to rise. It was quiet, the streets empty, the houses dark. For a moment I thought I was safe, but then I saw them. They were everywhere, standing in windows, sitting on porches, lurking in alleyways. Every single face was frozen in that same wide, impossible grin. This wasn't just about me anymore. The smiling monsters weren't following me. They were spreading. I stumbled into a diner on the edge of town, my heart pounding. The place looked abandoned, dusty tables, flickering lights, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I collapsed into a booth, burying my face in my hands. My mind raced with questions, with fears, with the growing certainty that I'd never escape. "Rough night?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see a man standing behind the counter, a worn apron tied around his waist. He didn't have the smile. His face was tired, his eyes bloodshot. "You're not like them," I said, my voice trembling. He laughed bitterly. Not yet. The man's name was Alan. He poured us both a cup of coffee and sat across from me, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. They've been here for weeks, he said, staring into the swirling smoke. At first it was just a few, standing in the shadows, watching. Then more came, and more. Why? I asked. What do they want? Alan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. They don't want anything, they're just waiting. For what? For you. Alan told me something I didn't want to believe. They're not just following you, he said. They're part of you. Don't you feel it? That connection, that pull? I shook my head, denying it even as I felt the hum in my mind growing louder. You brought them here, Alan continued. Wherever you go, they'll follow. And when they've consumed everything, they'll take you too. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd thought I was running from them, escaping their gaze. But the truth was worse. I was their anchor. I wanted to leave, but Alan stopped me. If you run, it'll only get worse, he said. You can't outrun them, you have to face them. How? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Alan didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a small, rusted key. There's a room in the back, you'll know what to do. I didn't understand, but I took the key anyway. The room was empty except for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw them. The figures stared back at me from the mirror, their grins wide and gleaming. But there was something different now. They weren't just watching me. They were me. Each figure in the mirror was a twisted reflection of myself, my face, my body, my smile. I realized then that the monsters hadn't been following me. They'd been growing inside me. The connection wasn't a curse. It was a transformation, and I was almost complete. Alan's voice echoed in my mind. You'll know what to do. The mirror shimmered, the figures shifting and writhing as they reached for me, their smiles widening. I could feel the pull, the hunger, the promise of peace if I just let go, if I let myself become one of them. But then I thought about the town, about Alan, about the people who would suffer if I gave in. I gathered the courage, raised my fist, and smashed the mirror. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted version of my face. The humming in my mind stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. When I stumbled out of the room, the diner was empty. The figures outside were gone, their smiles erased from the streets. For the first time in weeks, I felt alone, but I wasn't free. The connection was still there, a faint hum at the edge of my thoughts. The smiling monsters were gone, but I could feel them waiting, watching, just out of sight. And I knew they weren't finished with me. Not yet, I thought it was over. For days, the streets were empty. The shadows were just shadows again, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. I even started to believe that breaking the mirror had saved me. But tonight I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was soft at first, almost rhythmic, coming from the window beside my bed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to look, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it. Slowly I turned my head. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. My face. The grin stretched impossibly wide, the eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing, but when I turned around, another figure was standing in the corner of the room. It was me again, its smile frozen, its head tilting slightly as it stepped forward. The hum in my mind returned louder than ever, drowning out my thoughts. I backed into the wall, my chest tightening as more figures emerged from the shadows, each one a perfect copy of me, their grins splitting their faces in half. "Why are you doing this?" I screamed. The figures didn't answer. They didn't need to, because in the corner of my eye I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. I was smiling. I live with my parents, my aunt, and my cousin. My cousin and aunt's room is right across from mine, but my cousin's room is next to a still non-working bathroom that we use as storage. Everything was quiet until about 4 months ago, when I started hearing strange noises in my cousin's room. They were sounds similar to someone rummaging through drawers, but the most disturbing thing was that it always happened with the lights off. The first time I heard it, I was home alone. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. but the noises continued. With my heart racing, I walked to her door and, working up the courage, opened it. The room was dark and empty. No one was there. I immediately closed the door and went back to my room, feeling a chill run down my spine and goosebumps. When my cousin returned, I told her what had happened. She just looked at me like I was completely crazy and said, "You're delusional." Her response made me feel stupid, so I decided not to give it any importance. However, the noises continued, especially when no one else was home. No matter how hard I tried to ignore them, every time I heard them, a cold, anxious feeling would take over me. Eventually, the noises went away, and I came to think it had all been a product of my mind. But yesterday, something happened that made me rethink everything. I was in the living room watching TV with my sister when I remembered that I needed to make my bed, so I went up to my room. When I got to the hallway, I noticed that the light in my cousin's room was on, and, again, the same noises could be heard. Thinking that she had come home early, I spoke to her through the door, asking how she had been. Her response was curt, "Fine." I found her tone strange, but I didn't think about it any further. I walked into my room, made my bed, and upon exiting, noticed that the light in her room was now off. The odd thing was that I didn't see her walk down the hall to the stairs, and my room has a window from which I can see if anyone goes up or down. I thought maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. I assumed she had gone to sleep and went down to the living room with my sister. A few minutes later, we heard the front door open. My cousin had just arrived. I actually felt a chill run through my body when she said, "Hey girls, what are you doing?" I stared at her, my expression horrified. "Did you just get here?" I asked her, my voice shaking. She looked at me with the same look on her face as the first time I told her about the noises in her room and replied with obviousness, "Obviously, I just got here." My mind went blank. If my cousin hadn't been in her room, then who was up there? My family is gone. They were taken from me right before my eyes, ripped away like skin off my back. They're dead. My wife and daughter are dead, and the police think it's my fault. Like I would ever do something so horrible. I love them. With all of my heart, I loved my family. How dare those idiots at the police station accuse me of such a horrible— I thought I heard a noise just now, as I'm typing this out. Like someone was just outside my shitty little motel room, looking for me. He's still out there. The man that killed my family, the man that framed me. I think he's saving me for last. He's close. I can feel it. He took everything from me, but no one will believe me. You'll believe me, won't you? I'll tell you what happened. I just need someone to believe me. Before it happened, we weren't doing great. You know those usual familial fights? How the house can feel tense when disagreements happen? Well, the latest one was about a school field trip. She wanted $60 to go to some museum or something, but money was tight. I'd been killing myself on overtime for over a year now just to keep us afloat, but we were drowning anyways. Bills, groceries, clothes, insurance, car payments, the mortgage. God, it was just all too much. Well, anyways, I told her we can't afford to send her, but my wife insisted we could spare $60, so I had to be the bad guy. I told her we couldn't, and that was final. After that, I was getting the cold shoulder from both of them. So when I came home that evening after another 12-hour shift, I wasn't surprised to receive another sad excuse for a welcome home. My daughter sat in the living room doing homework on our coffee table. She had folders and papers strewn about. Her backpack sat open on my chair. She didn't acknowledge me when I walked in. My wife noticed me, at least. From past our living room in the kitchen, she gave me a lukewarm, "Hello, how was work?" I walked past my daughter and kissed my wife in the kitchen. I felt disappointed. She kissed me dispassionately, like she didn't even want to kiss me in the first place. "Long," I replied, taking off my steel toes. "How's dinner coming?" "It's going all right. I'm working with what I have." "Did you go to the store on your way home?" That was her first little jab of the night. Lately, she loved to needle me. She would tell me about her discontentment in passing. Discontentment about not having all the food she wants, or about how small the new house was, or about how we haven't had a date in over a year. I knew it. I knew she felt neglected and discontent. Just another thing going wrong that I wasn't fixing fast enough for her. "No, dear, I was too tired to go to the grocery." "Well then, it's soup again tonight. I don't have ingredients to make much else." There was so much more behind those words, more than I could put on a page. She knew I hated the soup we got from the food pantry. She knew I hated to go to the food pantry at all. She was saying that I failed. I failed to provide my family with dinner, and now we have to rely on strangers for help. And because I failed to provide, I should be punished with food I hated. I'm sorry, I was at work all day. Well, I don't have a car to take to the grocery. You have the only car. So you have to be the one to go to the store. I don't want to make soup again, honey. That honey stung. It was a sweet shot filled with poison. Another jab. Anger swelled in me. I already knew that I was the one that had to go to the store, that I had our only car, that I fucked it up. But she just had to twist that knife a little deeper. Even after all that I provide for them, she still had the nerve to be ungrateful, to tell me I'm not doing enough. I was about to tell her off. Tell her that she needs to have some patience and that I'm her husband and I deserve respect. But my thoughts were interrupted by a loud banging sound outside. My wife and daughter stopped and stared at the back door with wide, fearful eyes. They were deer in headlights, waiting for a car to crash through our house. When nothing came, they slowly went back to how they were. She continued to stir her soup, my daughter went back to her homework, and I just sat at the dining room table. I took a breath and tried to calm down. I was too exhausted to have another fight. Wordlessly, I went to go sit in the living room. My daughter still didn't greet me. She wouldn't acknowledge me at all. But she knew I was there. I could tell. She was tense, nervous. She acted like a bomb just sat right beside her. "Hey, kiddo." "Hi, Dad," she said quietly, as if anything louder might make me explode. "What you working on?" I asked with as much enthusiasm I could muster, hoping she would match it. "Schoolwork," she replied dryly. She was a whole other issue. She had gone quiet a while back, disconnected herself. Gone were the days of Daddy's little girl. Now she was a stranger who was afraid of me. I guess that's what happens when you're the bad guy too many times. "Can you give me more than a couple words, sweetheart? I missed you at work today, and I'd love to talk to you." She was frozen, afraid to look up, afraid to look at me. "Kiddo, I'm your dad. I just want to talk to you. I want to hear about school or your hobbies or your friends. Just anything, please." She was fighting back tears. "May I go to my room?" She squeaked out in a near whisper. "Why?" I asked, dropping my enthusiasm. "Why can't you just talk to your old man? I'm your dad." "She's had a long day and has a lot of homework. Just let her go to her room," my wife interrupted. "Oh, so you get to know about her day, but I don't? I'm not asking for much. I just want to talk to my daughter. Why won't you talk to me?" Another noise shook the house, much louder than the first. My daughter began to cry. My wife let out a yelp. I started to swear to myself as I went outside to figure out what all the noise was about. When I came outside, I found a man, standing by our trash bins. Garbage covered the driveway, apparently thrown around by the man. He was dressed like a factory worker. He wore a Carhartt shirt, jeans, and steel toe boots. The outfit looked like it could have been one of mine. He stood facing away from me. His hands were bloodied and swollen, like he just got through punching something. "It's not right, you know," he said to me, still facing away. "Who the hell are you? Get the hell off my property." He ignored me. "It's not right the way they treat you." "What the hell are you talking about? You're a hard-working man. You're an honest man. You work your ass off to give them a place to sleep. You buy them food to eat, and they don't even care. They aren't even grateful. So what the hell are you even doing this for?" "Because I love them," I answered. "But do they love you? Do they even like you? Do they even know you anymore? They don't treat you like a husband or a father. They use you. They take everything you give them without a second thought and then stick their hands out and ask for more. And what do you get in return? Passive aggression and one-word answers. You give away all of your love and you get none in return. That's not true. Fuck you, man. You don't know what you're talking about. They love me. We're just in a rough spot right now, that's all," I told him. My heart was beating out of my chest, threatening to burst with anger at the nerve of the stranger. But somewhere, deep down, I felt he was right. I did feel used, unappreciated, empty. "You're lying to yourself. You're letting yourself be deceived by them. She doesn't love you anymore. She thinks you're weak, worthless. She asks for too much. How much are you expected to give her? You've given all you have, and it isn't enough. You're not enough for her. Hers is a special kind of cruelty. Does it make your blood boil that parasite leeches off of you without a care for her host? And your daughter, how endlessly frustrating. How much effort does it take? How much can you try when she won't even look at you? She's scared of you, and for what? Trying to be a loving father, trying to talk to his daughter? How many times do you have to roll that boulder up the hill before you realize that she doesn't love you either? They hate you. They're killing you. They pile the world onto your shoulders and hate that you fall under the weight. They deserve to know how much you hurt. He turned to me and I saw his face. He looked like a tired man, stretched too thin. Dark circles hung under his eyes. His hair was oily and unwashed. His mouth was dry with cracked lips. Every feature on his face was twisted in disgust. Hatred, rage. His breathing was heavy. His hands shook with adrenaline. His eyes locked onto mine and I realized two things. He looked exactly like me and he was holding one of our kitchen knives. I became stuck, completely unable to move. My doppelganger seemed to know this. He paid me no mind as he walked past me. I tried to run. I tried to move at all. But nothing happened. I was a passenger in my own body with no control. He turned me so I was facing my house. I was forced to stand there and watch it all unfold through the windows. I saw him stomp up to my door and let himself inside, slamming the door back shut. I heard the man rampage through my house. He slammed the soup off the stove, letting the giant pot clatter loudly into the wall. My wife screamed my name. I struggled for control again, but I had none. I heard my own voice scream out in anger before my wife was stabbed. The sound of steel on bone pierced my ears. I saw her eyes. She gurgled in pain as her lungs filled with blood. I heard her ribs snap. All the while, a voice like mine screamed incomprehensibly in a rage about love and patience and kindness. I heard my daughter crying. I knew she was as frozen as I was, powerless to stop what came next. "Why won't you just talk to me?" My voice came from inside my house, muffled through the walls. She suffered the same fate as her mother. I was still frozen as the back door opened. He walked leisurely over to me. Blood spattered his shirt. It wicketed wildly, rolling off the hydrophobic fabric and dripped onto the pavement. His arms were buried in raised scratch marks, defensive wounds from my wife fighting back. His steel toe boots were drenched in gore. "It's just too much. I can't remember anymore." With a sardonic smile, he got up close. I was powerless to stop him as he scratched my arms and rubbed my family's blood onto my hands. He put his clothes on me and mine on him. They were soaking wet and I began to shiver. He put the knife in my paralyzed hand before stepping back and admiring his handiwork. Satisfied, he flashed me a quick red smile and then he was gone. When I regained control, I got in my car and ran away. He took them from me and I can't do anything about it. If the police find me, it's over. I'm done. They think I did that to them. I didn't. I couldn't. Everyone has bad thoughts sometimes, but that's not evidence. That's not real. I'm not capable of that. But those fucking idiots won't listen to me. It's not fair. I don't deserve this. I'm a good husband. I'm a good father. If I could just, someone is banging loudly on my door. The rapture has happened, and I was left behind. All my life I questioned the existence of a God. I sinned repeatedly, grappling with the idea that there couldn't be a God, at least not the one that Christians described. I thought I was right. It happened yesterday while I was working my cashier job at the local grocery store. Suddenly I was blinded by a light emanating from the sky. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the sky was no longer its usual blue. Instead, golden rays enveloped everything in sight. It was breathtaking. In that moment, I knew what was unfolding. A being descended through a crack in the sky, some sort of man-like creature draped in a pristine white robe that radiated an aura of superiority. It was God. I chose silence, mesmerized. I ran outside, unable to look away. Co-workers, friends, strangers, millions, began to float toward the being. I remained anchored to the ground. Then the being spoke. "My children, come witness your spiritual bodies in my kingdom. This day has been foretold since my word was created. The rest of you are not my children. Those who remain will face the punishment I leave for you. Blasphemers, murderers, rapists, ye who remain shall surely go to Lucifer." Tears welled in my eyes. What kind of God was this? I felt an overwhelming urge to shout, "Why us, God? What did you expect? You gave us a book, that was it. What kind of king are you?" For a fleeting moment, I could have sworn he looked down at me specifically. I turned and walked back into the store, standing amidst the chaos. I knew more painful emotions were yet to come, but I was determined to survive as long as possible. A month has passed since that day. My parents are gone. My brother is gone. Everyone. Now embers of some kind of fire rain down, little bits at a time. I've contemplated ending my own life, but I refuse to succumb. I will live as long as I can. I vow to anyone reading this, I won't die by my own hand. I've begun to wake each morning with strange carvings etched into my skin. This morning it was woe to those left behind. I can't make sense of it. What does it even mean? As I write this, riots and looting dominate the news. Is this what God wanted, to sow doubt about his existence, then watch us turn on one another? If he's still watching, I hope he sees the consequences of his actions. Children are dying every day. I will update this journal each month. 2 months in, the fire has intensified with each rainfall. My house is the only one on my block untouched by the chaos. It seems there were a lot of Christians running this country. Everything is in disarray, pure anarchy. I met a woman who was stuck in the rain. I let her in, treated her wounds, and offered her shelter. She accepted. You wouldn't think there could be happiness amidst this despair, but the rain has become a norm, and she and I have found a rhythm, living as we did before the rapture. Her name is Misty. I plan to start updating on our food supply each month. Crops are nearly impossible to grow in this fire rain. For now, we have enough to last a year if we ration wisely. 3 months in, the fire rains persist daily. Between downpours, I check the roof. A few weeks ago, we found sheet metal and reinforced our home. It should withstand the flames. Misty and I have grown closer. I feel a connection with her, but it frightens me. If something happened to her, I don't know how I would cope. The rioting and looting have slowed, mainly because there's nothing left to steal. The fire has decimated wildlife, so hunting is futile. Our entertainment has become board games. We discovered a stash of guns and food, ensuring we're relatively well off. Enough provisions for up to 2 years if we're careful. 7 months in. My phone broke and I haven't found a replacement. Everything is deteriorated. We are the last people left in town, though raiders have passed through occasionally. The only thing keeping me sane is Misty. A while back, she kissed me, and we've been together ever since. It feels reckless to care for someone in these dire times, but perhaps if I'm careful, it will be all right. I managed to get a radio working and have been trying to broadcast a message for help, a plea for a community we could join. So far, there's been no response. The rain has ceased, and we're unsure why. Misty and I are honing our skills with weapons just in case. We have about a year's worth of food left, maybe a year and a half if we ration well. 5 years in. I just found a functioning phone. If God is still watching, I want him to end my suffering. If the devil is, I hope he does too. Misty is gone. Our child Sean is gone. He was only 3 years old. Why, God, what did we do? We did nothing. What a terrible king you are. How are my parents? How is my brother? Where are the souls you took, damn you, God? If I can reach heaven, I'll find you and confront you myself. Listen closely, God. I have a Beretta M9 aimed at my temple. I'm coming for you, you liar. Misty, I'll see you again. Just wait for me. The longer I'm around, the more I realize that things just happen. They come and go, and you'll never get the answers you're looking for. That's kind of how Turkey entered my life in the first place. Turkey is a dog. He was my friend's dog. He was a good guy, my friend, I mean. Really outgoing and nice to everyone until one day when he just wasn't himself anymore. Shut himself off from the world and, well, you know, lots of traumas. But when all was said and done, Turkey needed somewhere to go, and I was looking for any support I could find, so I offered to house him. Turkey reminds me of how my friend was before. Always excited and ready to socialize. Just close your eyes and picture a golden retriever. There you go, you just imagined Turkey. Happy face, floppy ears, and golden fur, the works. I watched Turkey go from a pup with way too much energy to an old dog with way too much energy. We have been through a lot together. There were days when I'd look at Turkey and realize I'd known my friend's dog longer than I knew my friend. This was a somber thought, to be certain, but sometimes comforting. Like, I had this piece of my friend that got to grow with me even when he couldn't. You know? It drove me to be better, like he was always keeping an eye on me. Helped me a lot in life, and I'd say I'm doing well for myself. Turkey has been with me for all of it. Every promotion and every move. His favorite is our little adventures into the woods. We'd stay at the cabin my dad built with his own hands whenever time off from work permitted such a luxury. I bring up the cabin because that must have been where it started. Turkey is an indoor dog, but when we're at the cabin, he's allowed to venture as he pleases. It's the only time I can think of where something must have happened. He had to have run out into the woods and gotten into something. It's easy to picture him leaping around and plunging his nose into all the smells the wild has to offer, pressing his face just a little too close to some strange something or other. Maybe he was bit or crossed some strange threshold, I just don't know. I'm not sure when the first signs reared their ugly heads too. Maybe the plastic. What I assumed was plastic anyway. Turkey had started to spit out these little red flakes. They were hard and glossy. At the time, I assumed that he had just chewed up some toy he found, as he hadn't been acting strange prior. One piece was particularly large, and it must have cut Turkey's throat because it carried small trails of blood mixed with the mucus. Before you think I'm neglectful, I took him to the vet when he chucked up the bit with blood on it, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Well, the vet's bill was pretty insane, but other than that, Turkey had a clean bill of health. The vet was actually impressed given Turkey's climbing age. Still, Turkey kept leaving little red flakes lying around the house. I remember stepping on one. I was barefoot, and it was hard enough that it managed to pierce my skin, causing me to bleed. Or maybe it was when he started just staring off into space. Dogs do that, sure, but he would walk up to the wall, press his nose against it, and just stare there. He'd do it once or twice a week, and anyone I talked to just suggested early signs of dementia. Again, Turkey, he's old, and just because his body was healthy didn't mean his mind was. So I thought, sure, my dog just has a few quirks. He still loved to play catch. The same dog that liked to rub the bark off sticks with his teeth. I still had to stop him from chewing the handmade furniture in the cabin. Same dog that always spun around 3 times before deciding to lay down. Always 3 times. Same dog, my friend. The dementia thing probably made me overlook too many things. I remember rounding the corner one day just in time to watch Turkey walk across the room, sideways. He watched me continuously, moving steadily from one side to the other with perfect balance as if performing a waltz. It was uncanny to watch each time I saw it, unnatural. He'd also do this thing where his eyes would go wide, and I swear, it looked like he was trying to bulge them out of their sockets. It was so strange, but every time I took him somewhere to get checked out, there was nothing. Or at least, nothing they could explain. Things really ramped up when I found the first lump. Right able his right eye, every time I pet him I could feel it. It was a stiff bump. It felt like bone, but I knew in my heart that it hadn't been there before. This was confirmed when another larger bump appeared at the back of his temple, just as stiff and unmoving. The bump showed up during examination. The vet said it was practically bone, and they implied that maybe I just missed the spots before, that they were just oddities in how Turkey's skull developed. It became harder to go back to the vets with each failed visit, financially and spiritually. At this point, something was obviously wrong with him. His energy was lower, and he'd space out more and more, sometimes just staring at me unblinking for, God, hours. It would creep me out so much. Just waiting for him to move, it felt like he was going to lunge for me at any moment, but instead he'd eventually come to and trot off, sometimes even doing his strange sideways exit. More and more bumps appeared. They seemed to be growing at times too, one being large enough to pierce through his skin. After cleaning where it had poked through, I could see it was a dull red, just like the flakes he was spitting up. Whatever was happening to my dog, Turkey was gone. He just wasn't himself anymore. Whenever I looked into his eyes, I didn't see him. I just saw a silent plea, one I just a few weeks ago decided to answer. So, we went to the cabin. It was just me and him, sitting on the bathroom floor. I had tightly bundled him with the blanket from the bed we slept in throughout the years. He got to eat a couple of hamburgers, ones with a mix of drugs that made him more and more tired. With golden hour cresting through the bathroom window, we sat. My hand resting on his chest, I felt his frame rise and fall with each breath. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. I sat for a while, thinking I would feel his chest come back up again. But it didn't, and I was alone. Thinking that at the very least I got to say goodbye to my friend this time. The cocktail of drugs took longer to take effect than I initially thought, and by the time Turkey had passed, moonlight was filling the room. Finally deciding the world had to keep spinning, I stood up and just let Turkey lay there. I thought he deserved one last rest in the home, I guess, and so I went to bed and rested in it alone for the first time. It didn't feel right. It was so empty. I tossed and turned throughout the night, struggling to sleep. After several hours of giving it my best go, I ended up just lying there with my eyes open, staring at the wall, and then I heard a click. At first, it sounded like something had just fallen onto the roof, but then I heard it again. Click, I sat up in bed and waited for the noise to occur again. Click, I turned my head to the noise. It was definitely coming from inside the house. A faint and brief tapping. It sounded like a stone being dropped onto linoleum. Click, quickly shuffling to the side of the bed, I rose out, dropping the sheets onto the floor. Thoughts were bouncing around in my head, wondering if I locked all the doors and windows, trying to recall if I had seen any suspicious behavior, or if some raccoon had just made their way inside. Click, I stood in the hallway, peering down at the silver beams of light that spilled out from the open bathroom door as the clicking picked up in pace. My heart sank as I thought about the possibility of Turkey riding around on the floor, thinking that I had somehow messed up the doses and put him through more pain. Then the light coming out of the door was partially obstructed at the bottom of the doorframe. Click, my body was stiff, watching the shadows shift in tandem with the tapping emitting from within the bathroom. Getting larger and larger. Red, dull red, was the first color I could see poking out of the bathroom. In one swift motion, it moved out into the hall as if intentionally trying to shock me. A spastic and unforgiving revelation of the strange and twisted claw that pressed down onto the hallway's carpet. Obviously, I was astonished. My brain was firing off synapses to try to understand what I was seeing. The malformed, bleak, and dark representation of a crab's claw. It looked gnarled and jagged, covered in a glossy and heartbreaking red liquid. The claw was attached to a similarly messy-looking arm. It looked like old musty PVC piping and was about as thick as one of Turkey's arms. It twisted and creaked at the joint, pulling along the body behind it, revealing more and more horror with each drag forward. Strange clicking was replaced with a sudden thud, like a book dropping onto the carpet. The arm operating the claw led my vision to the complete desecration that had become of Turkey's face. I had what felt like an eternity to absorb the gruesome sight of my friend's ruined corpse, the silence amplifying the horror. His face had been split open, the crab's arm sticking out like a pipe that had pierced a seat cushion. The area was fractured and had red gleaming in the moonlight. His eye had shifted and was protruding. A thin column of muscle lifted the eye out of the socket, leaving it to bend around with each drag. Another pulls forward. I could see the other claw starting to make its way out of Turkey's face. Breaking through the surface, it pushed aside wet, matted fur. I could see where the thinning film of skin started to parse and tear, streams of red brighter than the claw spilling out. Each forward drag painted the carpet, the vibrant colors marking its territory. My heart could have broken bone, it was beating so hard. I retreated a step when the abomination pulled forward. Another sullied and filthy claw reached out and landed on the carpet, malformed and slightly smaller than the other. Embarrassingly, I tripped as I attempted to back off again. My body was so rigid and shaky, and it was hard to step correctly. My nerves didn't even register the pain of plummeting to the floor. All my mental capacity was focused on what had become of Turkey. How the claws, larger than his whole torso, would bend and strain to pull my dog's body behind it. With both claws out and articulating, though, the monster was moving fast and clearly coming towards me. Turkey's other eye made a sickening squelch as it popped free from his face and lifted next to the other. Both beads of darkness focused on me. What remained of Turkey's face was all fractured bone and torn skin. Only vaguely could I make out the picture of what he used to be. The proportions of it all seemed nonsensical. I can't imagine how such large claws were confined in a head smaller than them. The strength of the claws was already enough to drag the dog's body with relative ease. I started scrambling to my feet when it reached out, arm seeming longer than before, and smashed a claw down. It tore through my pants and ripped my skin open before I had enough time to draw it back. The wound gashed and spilled blood, soaking the surrounding fabric. My body was finally moving, and I was able to scramble to my feet again, feeling the pain of the open wound as I put pressure on it. The thing was quick to react to my movement, backing off slightly. Where Turkey's teeth used to be had been almost completely reworked in the transformation. Lips pulled back, revealing shriveled gums that had dissolved into a thick, soupy mess. The smell of decay thick in the air. His teeth, though, when it moved back, they chittered. Shaking, the pearly whites smacked against each other rapidly. It sounded like a rattlesnake trying to ward me off. I felt small, like this thing had set its sights on me and was reeling back for a final pounce. I didn't know if running or slowly backing away was the right move. I could vaguely see his side profile being illuminated in the sunlight. It was somehow the worst part, being able to see his torso riding around like that. I knew what was coming next, but my eyes just wouldn't avert. His ribs moved around rapidly under the skin. They pressed against the skin, protruding further and further each time. His teeth continued to rattle as what was once Turkey's ribs started to poke through the skin on his chest. Extremities the same dirty bone color as the arms attached to the claws reached out until they tapped on the floor. Metamorphosis. Turkey stood, his frame contorted into an unsettling silhouette, the very air around him seeming to crackle with a hellish energy. 8 legs on each side of his torso reached down and supported the rest of Turkey. They pushed down all over the carpet as the body twisted around like a centipede. I was running before I realized I had decided to do so. The awe finally turned into abject horror as I bounded for the stairs. I could hear it behind me, the way its feet landed on and pulled at the carpet. The rapid thud of the claws smacking the ground pulled the structure along. It was rapid, and I felt one of the claws try to pincer my leg, only managing to grab the fabric, but it was enough to send me flying. This time I felt the impact, body rag dolling down against the wall. I rebounded and let my body tumble around the corner, managing to stay upright. I turned around and took a brief look at the thing round the corner. The movements were sloppy. It crashed against the wall too. It hit hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Claws reached out to stabilize the body before it could properly topple over. It was so much faster than me. My leg, where it had scratched me, was hot and writhing in pain. It felt like someone had sliced me open with coral. There was no chance in hell that I was making it to the front door in time. Despite my best efforts to hobble forward, the crab monstrosity was on me before I could regain my footing. I fell to the floor again, and before I could try to get back up, I was surrounded by a cage of skittering legs. When it pushed me over, I toppled onto a side table my father had made with wood from the surrounding trees. My skin rubbed against the bark that remained on the table's legs, causing the skin to peel as I once again smacked the ground. My senses dulled as I rolled up and looked up at the towering desecration of my friend's dog. Of my friend. The crab loomed over me, both claws pressed down on either side of my head. Shoulders were confined by the imposing pincers. All I could do was feel the cold night's air punctuating each beat of sweat. The chittering got louder as it lowered its face to mine. I imagined my face blending into a fine mist, or those claws closing around my throat. All the ways that this horrid thing could rip me apart. It leaned closer and closer until I could practically smell its eye stalks. I peered into the dark, protruding marbles. My face faintly reflected on them and after. It reeled back and I grabbed the closest thing I could to defend myself, as futile as the effort seemed. Fingers wrapped around the table leg and I held it out in front of me as if it was some mighty sword. The crab version of Turkey halted. The eyes bent down to look at the stick of wood, and as it felt like fear was trying to get me to pass out, the crab lunged forward and closed its mandibles. On the stick. I watched, wide-eyed, as the crab chewed away at the stick, pulling the bark free and seemingly swallowing it. Using my feet, I pushed back slowly as the crab reached with its claw and grabbed another table leg, chewing on the furniture that Turkey was never allowed to. Slowly backing up, I got enough room to stand. Once again, I was in awe for a completely different reason. This horrible abomination, the absolute destruction of my dog. I watched it spin in a circle, once, twice, 3 times, and then it laid down, curling what was left of the dog's body into a ball, and it just kept chewing away at the stick. One stick after another vanished, chewed away by Turkey's strange mandibles. When he looked up at me, eyes shining in the light, I could see my dog. I know it's wrong, sick of me I do, but I just left. Closed the cabin's door behind me. I returned a few days later, a bundle of nice thick tree branches in tow, and opened the cabin door. It was quiet for a moment, and then I heard a rapid tapping approach. As it rounded the corner, I initially felt that fear again, soaking in all its features for what felt like the first time. Now soaked in daylight. A lot of the blood had been cleaned away by God knows what. Where the skin had been cleaned and healed, I could still see tufts of Turkey's golden blonde hair. And as it approached me, I held out a stick. It took the stick, and I watched my weird dog crab monster chew away, not a care in the world. Wild animals are unpredictable, and I'm sure someday this will all turn around on me. As strange as it sounds, I'm okay with that. Maybe one day Turkey will mistake my arm for a tree branch and shred all the skin off, Maybe his claws will someday separate my head from my body. But for now, as much as I can, I'll keep slipping away, tree branches in tow, to hang out with my best friend. It started when I was on a road trip, stopping at a dingy roadside motel off the highway. The sign buzzed weakly in the night, and the old man at the front desk barely looked up when I checked in. "Room 6, he muttered, sliding a key across the counter. I didn't even have to sign anything. The room smelled like mildew and cheap cleaner. It wasn't good, but I wasn't in a good place. My husband, soon-to-be ex, and I had gotten into another fight. He shouted, I shouted, the dog barked, I left. And then I was there at Palm Island Motel, just 3 miles south of the Georgia border. My mood was so far south there wasn't any map left for it to travel down. The flickering bathroom light annoyed me. Big surprise, everything was annoying me. I decided to turn it off and wash my face in the dim glow of the nightstand lamp. I turned the faucet and fell, not onto the grimy motel tiles, not onto anything solid, just down. I woke up on my back, staring at a ceiling lined with flickering fluorescence. The air was thick with chlorine. When I sat up, I realized I was lying on smooth, damp tile, inches away from a shallow, still pool. It stretched out infinitely. The water was the most picturesque shade of blue, cartoon blue. The air was humid, pressing against my skin, and as I sat up, I realized that stark white walls surrounded me. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed into nothing. Holy shit, what the hell just happened? There was no answer, no doors, no windows, no signs of life. I started walking. The walls formed a maze around me, leading to more pools, more tiled corridors, more silence. I've never been more afraid in my life. I don't know how long I wandered before I saw the first sign that I wasn't alone. A ripple. The water in one of the distant pools shuddered, just for a moment, before going perfectly still again. My pulse pounded as I scanned the empty halls. Nothing, just the endless pools, the buzzing lights. Then I saw them. Wet footprints, not mine. They led around the corner, disappearing into another room. I didn't follow them. I thought, shit, if someone else is down here, what if they aren't friendly? It felt like the sort of place where unfriendly people would congregate. Unfriendly things, I should have. Hindsight, right? It's always 20/20. That night, if it was night, something whispered my name, Maria. I sat upright. My eyes scanned the small room I had taken shelter in. White tiles, blue water, bright lights, no one else was there. This isn't funny. My voice shook. I pulled my knees closer to my chest and tried to ignore the grumbling of my stomach. Ron? I don't know why I called out for my almost ex. I didn't really think he was down here, wherever he happened to be. I just didn't know who else to guess. Silence greeted me. I didn't sleep again that night. It was the start of a habit. I don't sleep much here. I try really hard not to, mostly because someone always calls my name right when I go to sleep. It feels dangerous. But exhaustion gets the best of everyone, and several days, though they felt like years, into being here, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a splash. A deep one. Close. My stomach twisted as I sat up. The pool beside me had ripples spreading outward. Something had been there. Maybe still was. Then I heard the breathing. Slow. Wet. Just beyond the next hallway. I pressed myself against the tile, barely daring to breathe. A shape moved. A figure, tall, lanky, dripping with water, stood at the edge of a pool just beyond my sight. It didn't move like a person. It swayed, almost floating above the tile, as if deciding whether or not to step into the water. The skin looked almost like wet wax in the bright neon white, the limbs elongated and seemingly jointless. Then it bent at an unnatural angle and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. That was days ago, I think. I've been moving constantly, keeping my back to the walls, avoiding the water. That's hard. There's not a lot out here other than water. But today I found something new. A metal door, rusted and slick with condensation, stands at the end of a narrow hallway. It's the first thing that doesn't belong here. The only way out, it has to be. I know that it has to be. But I hesitated. There are wet footprints leading up to it, none coming back. I don't know if I should go in there or stay here and keep hoping that creature doesn't come back. If anyone finds this, remember me and don't trust the water. My wife is fun-loving, adventurous, and very family-oriented. Or at least she was before this all began. Very early in our relationship, she made it clear how important having a family was to her. This scared me a little bit, but I wasn't opposed to kids, and we had such a great time together. We hiked, camped, biked, and simply enjoyed being outdoors. Sometimes she would daydream out loud about what it would be like to do all those things with a child of our own, and to share all their new experiences with them. We ended up moving in together about a year after we started dating, and I was working 2 part-time jobs while she was working a full-time night shift job, as well as attending college in the morning. We had no time and were barely making ends meet for a while there. COVID was her senior year of college, and I was one of the lucky few who got the opportunity to advance in my career due to the pandemic. We got married and saved all of our extra cash, and were fortunate enough to buy a house while the market was still way too hot. It was definitely a fixer-upper, and it's still presently a work in progress. But it was our own place to do with as we pleased. 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. We imagined what life might look like with those rooms filled. Then we had our first son. Postpartum was a hard season, as neither of us slept much with the newborn, and my wife struggled with postpartum depression. But after the first month and a half, we had longer bouts of sleep, and some actual time for our little family. We live in a state where both parents get 3 months off, paid for bonding with the new child, so my wife set up a handful of trips, and as a family of 3, we hiked and camped and went to the beach. It was great and felt akin to the beginning of our relationship. Those months went by fast. Soon we were back to the slog of full-time jobs and now navigating daycare drop-offs and pickups. Where we would normally sleep in on the weekends, we now were up early with our baby. Sometimes this led to tension, but mostly we handled it well, and the love we share for our son outweighed any of the inconveniences to our day-to-day lives. It's an adjustment period for sure, though, as you continually practice putting the needs of another being above your own. But it's so rewarding. Our baby boy turned 1, and my wife wanted to begin trying for another baby. I had no complaints with that request. That experience was much different than the first. This time, it took many months and doctor appointments and blood draws and pills. We grew apart as my wife would go from hopeful 1 week to deeply distraught the next. She'd spend a day curled up in bed instead of out in the yard, playing with her baby she already had. I felt that she was being ungrateful, but I'm not a woman and it's not my body, so the understanding was lacking. This caused a rift between us some days. Months passed, and it was Christmas Day. Like many wives, mine does the heavy lifting when it comes to the holidays. There were several packages neatly wrapped under the tree, and stockings on the mantel were filled to the brim. I didn't know what was in the majority of it. She recorded our son opening his gifts for his second Christmas. It was great watching his little face light up with each new toy or candy or article of clothing, though the wrapping paper was his actual favorite. My wife then pointed the camera at me and told me to open my stocking. I pulled out a few thoughtful gifts, too much candy, and what I thought was some sort of marker, but it wasn't. It was a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines in the test window. I started to cry and we embraced. She sent the video clip to her friends and family as the Christmas morning announcement. We were really happy. The ultrasounds were my wife's favorite appointments with our first son, and she made a little paperclip chain on the calendar to count down the days until we got to see this new little life for the first time. The guys at my work gave me some grief about needing an extra long lunch that day to be able to make the appointment. It was important to my wife, and since I can't feel what she feels, it's a connective point to have the visual of what's going on inside of her. It was the same doctor she had seen with our first in the same ultrasound room, the same gel on her lower abdomen and reclining back on the same chair. She was more relaxed this time, expectant of what we were about to see. But it wasn't the same. The gestational sac was there, and a small lump lay still, not bouncing and kicking like our first. My wife's smile faded, and I took the rest of the day off to head home and be with her. Her mom watched our son. The miscarriage wasn't natural. The baby, our second son, had to be surgically removed. My wife was incredibly distraught, and had grasped onto the little shred of hope that there may be signs of life, requesting an ultrasound prior to the procedure. He remained right where he'd been. The doctor talked to me while she was still asleep, Decay on the tiny body had already begun to take place, which could have been very dangerous for my wife. This solidified for me that this was the right choice, but my wife recoiled at that detail when I told it to her later. She had a few days of pretty intense pain, but made a full physical recovery. Mentally was a different story. There were several nights after we put our son to bed that my wife would lock herself in the bathroom and sob. Loud, breathy sobs, where she couldn't have answered me verbally if she wanted to. I would ask her to let me in, to be with her, to hold her. But she had none of it. She wanted to be alone, so I left her alone. I thought that might help. But when her bathroom sessions ended, she'd come at me vehemently. "What are you even doing? Did you even care? What's the matter with you?" I tried to explain how I was also processing this loss, but at the same time, trying to care for her and our son. I think she actually hated me. She no longer came to bed with me, but opted for the couch. I tried to show my care by covering her up with her favorite fuzzy blanket and placing her water bottle on the side table to encourage her to drink something. She'd at least oblige me and take a sip. Aside from the week off after her procedure, she still went to work, dropped off and picked up our son and made dinner. She was still keeping up daytime routines and childcare, but when our son went to bed, she'd turn back into the disheveled, sad lump on the couch. We live above a graveyard and sometimes take our son to the little pond there to feed the ducks and geese. But that day, my wife took our son to the little burial plot where our second child was being put to rest. I do regret that I didn't get the day off, but I didn't know how to process it all. And if I'm being honest, it felt a bit more grandiose than it needed to be. Miscarriages aren't uncommon, sadly. But it turned out none of the family could make it. Maybe they were actually too busy, or maybe they shared my sentiments. Who knows? Regardless, my wife was there, with our son, some strangers, and a pastor who gave a nice speech about the tiny little body in the tiny little box. I got a picture of flowers on the graveside, and my wife didn't say much else to me. I tried to apologize, but she wouldn't have it, and I can't say I blame her. I wouldn't have guessed that no one else would make it, but that's just shifting the blame. That night I had stayed up late, and I'd gone to check on her before I got into bed. She lay in what looked like a terribly uncomfortable position, but the soft snoring confirmed she was asleep. I covered her with her blanket and turned off the lamp. I made my way out of the living room into the bathroom to get myself ready for bed. When I opened the bathroom door, I jumped back with a shout. She was just standing there in the hall, staring at the wall. "What are you doing? I thought you were asleep. You scared me." Nothing. She didn't acknowledge me at all. I'm prone to the occasional sleepwalking episode, and given all the physical and emotional stress she was under, I figured it was completely plausible that she was having an episode herself. "Come on, hun, let's get you back to bed." She turned her head immediately and met my eyes. "No. I'm sorry, I thought you were sleepwalking." We stood there for too much time, her eyes locked on mine with such an intensity. Anger, resentment, disdain, all of the above. Finally, I just exasperatedly told her, "I'm really sorry. I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry I missed the burial. I'm sorry you're going through this. What do you want me to do? I really don't know how to help you here." But she just stared, unblinking, until she finally turned around and went to curl back up on the couch. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much, and I could feel the space between us growing wider. The next day, she got up like normal and was fully in her work mom mode. She didn't really acknowledge me, but that wasn't unusual since all of this had started. I was just glad that she was talking and tending to our son. It was nice to hear her voice in a semi-normal manner. We went to work, came home, she had dinner on the table, I cleaned up, and we put our son to bed together. She was still awake when I came to see her before bed, but she kept her face buried in her phone. I said, "Good night," and continued on my way. I also fell into the phone trap before going to sleep. My back was turned to the door as I scrolled mindlessly through reels. Eventually, I turned the phone off and rolled to switch off the lamp and startled again. She was right there, standing at my bedside, not saying a word. "Honey, don't scare me like that. Are you coming to bed tonight? Here, let me fix the pillows." She continued in her silence and didn't move towards the bed. "Are you coming to bed?" I repeated to no avail. This time, her eyes weren't right on mine, but seemed to be looking past me. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. "Hun, we really need to get to bed. It's a work night." But she wouldn't leave, and I couldn't sleep with her looming over me like that. I seriously didn't know what to do, but what I decided on probably wasn't the right choice. I sat up with no movement from her still, and I wrapped my arms around her waist, picking her up in one quick motion. She began kicking violently and punched at my back. "That actually hurt," I exclaimed, dropping her. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "I need to go to bed. You need to go to bed. You've got to go somewhere." Her face went back to deadpan, and she continued to just stand there. "I'm serious." My voice raised as I was reaching my wit's end. "Tomorrow isn't promised," she said flatly, and finally turned to head back to the couch. My elevated emotions kept me awake for some time after she'd left. To my dismay, this became a trend. I'd get ready for bed, and at some point between the bathroom visit and turning off the lamp, she'd appear, wordless and staring off into space. Sometimes at me, sometimes at a wall or an object. I started to just ignore her and eventually could manage sleep despite her presence. I mentioned therapy, but she was uninterested. She blamed the price, and I told her that we would manage and it was important for all of us. She still refused. I tried to let it go, since it wasn't affecting our son, but even under the circumstances, this was obviously not normal. She had become very depressed after the birth of our first son, and I knew she had gone through the same hormone dump, but without the baby this time. So, I just tried to rationalize it as best as I could. The internet said it would take a few weeks for her hormone levels to get back to normal, but we were well past a few weeks. I felt helpless. For me. For her. For the whole situation. I chose to call her mom and didn't go into details, but just let her know that her daughter was not doing very well mentally. Apparently, she hadn't shown any alarming behavior to the rest of the family, just the normal motions of grief that one might expect. Her mom came and took her on a little outing, and my wife seemed to be in a better mood when she got back. She'd gotten a gift for our son, and they played together until it was time for bed. She didn't say much to me, but for the first time in weeks, she got into our bed. There was such a huge sense of relief. I'd done the right thing. Things were going to get better from here. I had vivid nightmares that night, and I woke up in a cold sweat. To my horror, as adrenaline was already high, I saw that my wife had rolled towards me, with her large eyes and blank expression. Thinking maybe I'd scared her, I told her I'd had a nightmare, but she continued to stare and say nothing. "Great, whatever," I said, rolling back over. It was better anyways to have her staring at me from in the bed rather than standing over it. Probably due to already having a nightmare, I just couldn't shake the feeling of her watching me. I tossed and turned and kind of hoped she'd leave the bed, but she didn't. So much for better. The next morning I got up for work and she was still asleep. This was not super unusual, so I went on my way, groggily. By the time I was actually ready to leave for work, our son was up and running around, but my wife still hadn't left the bed. I went in to gently nudge her. "Hey, I need to leave for work. Baby's awake, so I need you to get up." I can't even emphasize how angry her eyes were as she began waking up. Irritated by the daggers she shot my way, after all, she was the one who had kept us both up the night before. I went back to the living room and got our son a cup of milk and put on a TV show for him. I waited for my wife to emerge, but she didn't. The clock was ticking. I went back to the bedroom and she was in the bed staring. She didn't look at me, but just blankly stared at the wall. This behavior hadn't translated to the morning before this, and I had no time to wait for her to come out of it. From all of our night experiences, I knew there was no time frame for this, and we both needed to leave for work. I snapped my fingers in front of her expressionless eyes. "We need to get to work. We do not have time for whatever this is." She didn't budge. I walked forward and put my hand on her shoulder, but before I could take back that action, she bit me. She drew blood. "Ah, what are you doing?" I cried, and at that point I heard the quick little footsteps of our son running to see what was happening. Shit. 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 Clutching the bite, I turned out and closed the door behind me before our child could witness his mom, the feral animal. "What happened, Dad?" he asked so innocently. "Where's Mama?" "Mama's still sleeping, but I told her she has to get up because Dad has to go to work." "Oh, okay." And he walked back out to the living room. The absolute trust he had in us both was both astounding and terrifying. I went to the bathroom to wash my hand, blood running down the white porcelain. You could clearly see where her teeth had each individually pierced the skin. I grabbed a large bandage and covered it up the best I could. Then she came out of the room, in her work clothes back to normal, like none of this even happened. "No, we need to talk about this. What the hell was that?" This is not something we're just shoving under the rug. She didn't even acknowledge me. She just brushed past me and began brushing her teeth and putting her hair up. You can't do that to me. You can't be like this around our son. This is not okay. Don't touch me, stated very coldly, but at least I got words out of her. I'm sorry for grabbing your shoulder, but I need you to tell me that this behavior will stop. I don't know what to do. Back to no response. She walked out of the bathroom and greeted our son, and I arrived to work late. I was so worried about what the night would hold that I chose to stay at work longer than normal. She never got into that crazy state before putting our son to bed, but a side of me recognized how unpredictable this behavior was becoming. I decided to head home a half hour before bedtime. Dinner would be done, I could step right into the cleanup, and we could all do story time after that. Like a normal family. Much like the ultrasound of our second, what I expected was not what I saw. Hello? Are you two in here? Baby, please answer me. No noise, an empty house, nothing was out of place or riffled through, and my wife's car was still parked in the driveway. I dialed my wife's number and I could hear her phone vibrating in the other room. I ran over there, but it just lay on the bed. No way to call her or track her location. I began my search on foot. Maybe it was just an innocent after-dinner walk, except it was dark now and our road had no streetlights. In fact, with the whole expanse of graveyard behind our house, the whole thing is very dark and encased in the trees and shrubbery growing along its border. Walking turned into jogging as each minute passed without me finding them. I went up and down the main road, down side roads, around the whole perimeter of the graveyard. There was no sign of them. The entrance to the graveyard was locked. I rattled the iron gate to see if it would budge, to no avail. The fence was lower on the east side, but I couldn't imagine how she might possibly get our son over the fence along with herself. But where else could she be? Looking down the street for witnesses and seeing none, I was able to climb over it without much issue. I began running through the graves. The grounds had rolling, grassy hills, lots of plant life, large trees littered throughout, and a central pond. It was very picturesque in the day, but the darkness made it feel vaster at night. Shadows cast by plants moved with the breeze and would act as camouflage for a shadow from the living. I went section by section. Angry honks and flapping wings made me fall backwards as I made it to the pond. The dumb geese had now made my presence known to anyone and everyone, whether that be good or bad. Running through the birds, I kept moving. I wished now more than ever that I'd attended the burial. Up a hill and rounding a corner, I saw a very large tree, easily wide enough to hide behind. I could see small objects dangling from it, but couldn't make out exactly what they were. I slowed my pace and tried to be as quiet as possible as I approached. They were little toys, strings grown into the branches, obviously put there long ago. The section of child and infant graves. Getting as close to the tree as possible, I peered around it, and at the far end of the section I could make out a figure with a smaller one beside it, but they were both very still. Toddlers are not still creatures. The hair raised on the back of my neck. Should I sprint to them? Should I try to sneak my way over? Before I could choose my next move, my wife's head turned and she stared right at me, from across the whole entire section. I shuddered but decided to sprint for them. She didn't run. She stayed in her spot, our son with her. He was holding her hand. Why wasn't he looking towards me? Why wasn't he acknowledging the hurried steps coming right toward him? What had she done to him? I snatched him and lunged back out of her arm's length, prepared to run again, but she still didn't move. She glared, unblinking, her unnerving stare only partially covered by her disheveled hair. Squatting down, breathless, I finally noticed that our son was staring blankly at a tiny headstone engraved with our last name and only one date. I wrapped my arms around him, but his eyes stayed transfixed to that spot, and he still said nothing. "What did you do to him?" I demanded. The ghostly remnant of my wife only stared back. "Answer me, what did you do?" "Nothing." "We have to go home. We're going home." At this point, I couldn't care less if she wanted to rot on the ground along with the child that we lost. I turned and started to leave with our son, but he turned to keep the grave in view. I shuddered and chose to cover his eyes with one hand, while scooping him up in the second. "Say bye-bye to the baby," I told him softly. My wife lurched forward, but I had just enough time to break into a sprint myself. I'm generally faster than her, but carrying 40 pounds in one arm did not help. "What do you want?" I yelled back. Only audible breaths came from her as she continued her pursuit. Stop, you're scaring him. You're scaring me. I started running down the hill back towards the pond when something caught my foot. I dropped my son, arms naturally coming out to try and stabilize myself, but I still ended up tumbling down the hill. By the time I reoriented, she had him again. No, stop! What are you trying to do? I stumbled back up the hill, and this time I used my full weight to knock her onto the ground, inadvertently pulling our son down with her, but leaving her pinned under me. She screamed and squirmed and tried to bite, legs kicking any way they could, nails digging into whatever part of me she could reach. Our son finally seemed to come out of his trance and began crying at the unsightly events before him. Look what you're doing, I yelled at her, but she just continued to writhe. Dad, stop it, Dad. You're hurting my mama. The little voice screamed, and he started hitting and kicking me as well. Look what you're doing, I repeated, voice breaking. Look what you're letting this do to us. You can't bring the dead back to life, and you're destroying your relationships with the living. She finally went still, though our child continued to fight for his mama with all of his might. I slowly rolled off her and hugged our son tightly. I'm sorry, I whispered. We all got up slowly, but my wife went right back in the direction of the tiny gravestone, head hung low. I took my son by the hand and we headed home. In South Africa, deep in the Transvaal, there is a place known as Nooitgedacht. This place has a history to it, having been a battleground more than once. It was a battlefield during the Anglo-Zulu War, and again during the Boer War in 1900, under the command of Koos de la Rey, who many South Africans to this day consider a war hero, and Christian Beyers. The Boer were able to defeat a British brigade at this site. From my understanding, both were particularly bloody battles that resulted in a fair amount of bloodshed and death. But its wartime history is not the only aspect of Nooitgedacht that makes it interesting. The people of the towns near this site all hold on to one particular superstition. And because of this, whenever there is a sickle moon in the night sky, people close their windows and lock their doors. You won't find a soul outside past dark on nights like these. Were you to ask, anyone would tell you that being out during the sickle moon was to risk your own soul, to risk being taken by the ghost of Nooitgedacht, or the things that follow him. It's a familiar story. My grandmother would tell it to my sister and I when we were little. At some point during the 1800s, there was a thief in the Transvaal region of South Africa. Not unlike tales of cowboys from the American West, this man, whose name has been lost to his own legend, would ride from town to town on a dark horse in search of profit. In one of the nearby towns, this man robbed a bank. Some stories say it was gold he carried away, others say it was paper money. The townsfolk pursued him, and soon the thief saw that he couldn't keep up this chase. He became desperate, and in his desperation he called out to offer the only thing he could, his own soul. To the devil he offered his soul if only he could escape with his riches. As the story goes, the devil gladly accepted the deal, and a great wind began to blow up dust that blinded and confused the men chasing the thief. With a giddy laugh, the man rode off to the wilderness, into the cliffs where he wouldn't be found. There, somewhere deep among the rocks and cliffs, he buried his treasure so that no one could take it from him, securing his wealth. But of course the devil had fooled the man. The terms of their deal was that he was entitled to the man's soul after he had escaped with the stolen riches, not necessarily only after the man had died. As soon as he had buried his money, the devil appeared to the man, ready to drag him to hell. The rider, in a state of panic, jumped on his horse and rode with all his might in an attempt to escape his fate. At some point in his flight, the man realized he had not marked the burial spot of his treasure, and he couldn't remember exactly where in the cliffs he had hidden it. To torment him, the devil cursed him. He would forever be chased by the legions of hell in an eternal search for his hiding spot. And so, every night under the sickle moon, the thief returns on a horse whose hooves kick up glowing embers and rides through Nooitgedacht in search of his treasure. I never believed in ghosts, but I do believe in money. So, when I was 16, I figured I'd go see for myself if there truly was a buried treasure out in the wilderness. Everyone else was too scared of the supposed ghost to do the same, so I figured I'd have no competition. I set out one day while the sun was still high in the sky with a mix of hope and greed in my heart. My hometown is nearby, so it only took about an hour or two to reach where I was going. Honestly, I really wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I figured I'd wander through the cliffs and look for any spot that looked promising. I walked and I dug until my knees began to click and arms trembled, but I never found any hint of my prize. In my search, I hadn't noticed the sun setting over the horizon until most of its light had gone. The sky was a beautiful mix of violet and crimson, but despite the beauty of the sunset, I couldn't ignore my nervousness. I told myself, it's just a stupid ghost story. It's just as real as monsters under a kid's bed. Still, I decided it was time to head home. I left the rocky drags and began my walk home. By now, night had come and the crooked moon smiled down at me from up high. My mouth went dry as I remembered the legend. But it was just a ghost story. It was never supposed to be real. I felt the road beneath me quake as the sound of hooves drummed in my ears. My heart dropped and my knees nearly failed me. I turned around to look down the road. There was a figure in the distance, one rapidly growing nearer and nearer. His skin wasn't pale, it was pure white like snow and cracked like dry clay. His eyes were like burning coals and tongues of fire spilled out of his open mouth. His pitch-black horse had hooves that glowed like hot iron. Smoke billowed from its nostrils, and its eyes were the same as its rider's. I ran off from the road into the wilderness. I didn't turn back until I was hidden behind a boulder. In truth, it's not the rider I was afraid of. He was terrifying, of course, but he didn't compare to the horrors that trailed close behind him. The legend had said that the legions of hell chased after the rider, but I had imagined cartoonishly red demons with bats' wings and pitchforks flying after him. Not this. The fields of wilderness behind him were swallowed by an even line of flames like a brush fire. As he rode, the burning line pushed forward with him, hungry to swallow him. Behind that line was what I can only describe as hell. It was as if earth and hell had begun to merge together. There was an abyss of blackness behind that fiery border. I could see hands, faces, whole people trying to claw their way out of the dark. Their skin was black like tar and cracked like the rider's, but through the cracks I could see glowing red and orange. Like a burnt tree stump filled with embers. I could hear them, a million groans and screams of damned souls. It's a sound I'll never be able to forget. As I watched from my hiding spot, I realized that the things in the pit weren't trying to escape their fate. They were reaching for the rider, grabbing at the air in his direction, yearning to pull him into hell with them, horse and all. I stayed there behind that boulder until morning, praying to God that they wouldn't find me, that I wouldn't share their damnation. When morning came, I decided I'd give up my search for treasure. Let the man have his money. I wanted to go home. When I left my hiding spot, nothing remained from the night before. No fire, no ash, no demons, nothing. Of course, people I told about it called me either a liar or an idiot. A lot of them laughed at me for it. But I know what I saw that night. So please, for your own sake, keep away from the road to Noitgedacht. Growing up, I had two choices in life. I could follow in my father's footsteps as a farm equipment maintenance worker. It was a decent job with decent pay, but I always got this sense of dread whenever I walked by his workshop. It was this big windowless building in a pale green color, and I always had this feeling that if I stayed there for too long, that place would eat me alive. So I went with the other choice in life, my mother. She was always larger than life, and she wanted me to be too. She was all about the hustle. When she and my father went separate ways, she took me and my sister across the country to Bangkok. She was the embodiment of Aut Pria Waikin Wan, roughly translated to, endure the sourness and enjoy the sweetness later. She would take any job at any time and claw her way upward. So my sister and I turned out the same. We would work, study, and socialize. We were supposed to be everything at once, smart, strong, cultural, and opinionated. I studied computer science at night and worked delivery during the day. I got a pretty good eye for traffic, so I can make it around the city without fearing for my life. That's easier said than done. Traffic laws around here seem to be more of a suggestion rather than law. I also did the odd job making websites for friends, family, and acquaintances. That would eat up most of my weekend nights. And finally, the one job that never paid me anything, looking out for my sister. My sister Isara worked as a club and event promoter in the inner city. She mostly worked weekends and nights, and I'm the only one she trusts to watch her back. If someone bothered her, I'd be on call. If she needed a sudden ride home, I'd be on call. I'd get yelled at for being late, or for not responding fast enough, or for 1,000 different reasons. It was by far the worst job I'd ever had, but family is family. I would be working so much that the only time my friends would see me was when I came around to pick up Izara. They started to call me Elik or Lurk, something you say when it's time to close for the night. I was the closing time guy. When I showed up, it was time to go home. Not the most fun nickname to be stuck with in your early 20s. When my mother passed from pancreatic cancer in 2020, I just turned 21. I was put in a position where I had to support both myself and my sister economically. Sure, she pulled part of her weight too, but she was looking ahead. She wanted to work in cosmetology, especially in movies and TV shows. That would take money and time. So for a while there, I had a lot of sudden weight put on my shoulders. Studies, work, more work, and being there for Isara. I barely slept, and when I did, I'd wake up at the slightest sound. I was so used to sleeping lightly, waiting for my sister to call for a pickup. But I didn't have a lot of choice. I had to keep going for everyone's sake. So I made a plan. I just had to make it until I was done with my studies. I looked for temporary solutions. I'd take caffeine pills, but they ended up giving me a stomachache. I tried this dextrose drink from a local pharmacy, but that thing almost gave me arrhythmia. I didn't want to try any heavier stuff, so I kind of gave up hope. Then I met a guy named Somyat. Somyat is a nice guy in the wrong kind of business. About 10 years older than me, but 30 years older at heart. To this day, I'm not sure what he really does, apart from co-managing a couple of downtown clubs. I think he buys things from places you shouldn't, some kind of gray area importer. He was a part owner of a club where Isara worked on the weekend. The first time I met him, he was sitting outside the club with a cold beer, having a cigarette. He didn't look like the owner, so I sat down next to him to tie my shoes. He looked me up and down. "You just gonna sit down like that?" he asked. "You got an appointment?" "I need an appointment for a chair." "For my chair, yeah." "You the boss?" "I'm a boss, yeah." I was too tired to care, and frankly, getting my sister fired from that place would have made my life easier. So I looked right back at him. "You don't look like a boss to me." I didn't know if he was going to hit me or hire me, but he ended up belly laughing and offering me a cigarette, so I guess I made the right choice. I would spend about 1 or 2 nights a week at Somyat's club. He'd offer me a job, but the pay was awful and I was busy with other things. I literally didn't have enough hours of the day to work for him. I think that was for the best, though. He was a great guy to hang out with, but he must have been an awful boss. Cheap bastard. Somyat had some sympathy for me, though. I was working hard to make ends meet, and he respected the hustle. He offered me a couple of side gigs. For example, picking up leftover credit cards at ATMs. There's a kind of ATM that takes a long time for the card to come back out, so a lot of tourists think it ate them, so they leave the card behind. Somyat paid a little for each card I could bring him, so I would walk around and pick them up while waiting for Isara to finish work. Every little bit helps. We developed a good friendship. I would show up an hour or so before Isara needed a pickup just to hang out with Somyat. We'd usually just talk about movies, cars, girls, whatever came to mind. I didn't have a lot of people in my life I could just talk to about nothing, and I don't think he did either. We'd usually end up having a beer and chew betel nuts. They're these nuts that you wrap in a leaf and chew. It gives you a pick-me-up that makes your mouth burn. It sums up Somyat pretty well, legal but spicy. But things took a turn when I was invited to a private party of his. See, I'd been up for 27 hours straight at that point. I'd been working on a large project for my computer science class, and I'd been trying to get a couple of extra hours in at the delivery company. That, and a client needed me to redo their homepage after it got hacked. It was a perfect storm of a lot of little things all at once, and it drove me to exhaustion. But I still got to Somyat's party. He had a nice place outside of town. He'd invited some people from the club and some business associates. He had these parties about once every 6 months or so. It was a way to show appreciation and brag a little. Still, Somyat had pulled out all the stops. He'd felt sorry for me, seeing me work so hard, and he'd brought a guy there from a research institute. They needed people for a data entry job, and he thought it'd be my kind of thing. Problem is, I was so tired I looked like I was on drugs. I didn't even understand the guy was offering me a paid position. As the party died down, Somyat took me aside and sat me down for a chat. We chewed some betel nuts and he took off his sunglasses. The man didn't look me in the eyes a lot, so I knew something was up. "I worry about you," he said. "You're working too hard." "I'm sorry," I said. "It's not that I don't appreciate this, but I had so much to do." "Then tell me," he continued. Tell me how I can help." "You don't need to do anything," I said. "I'm just glad to have a friend, you know?" I could see the wheels turn in his head. His eyes welled up a little. He gave me a hug and took me out to the veranda overlooking the city. He patted me on the back. "You deserve better," he said. "I'll get you something better." The following weekend, I got a text from Somyat. He was excited to show me something. He usually had something to share, but this time seemed different. I was a bit anxious about seeing him, but it was a nice change of pace. So that Saturday, I was invited into the club. I went straight past the bouncer, through the dance floor, and into the back rooms. From there, I followed a corridor to a small office at the back of the building. After all I'd seen from Somyat, I expected something grander. But it was just a little office with an old laptop, a USB fan, a couple chairs, and a shitty TV in the corner. All accentuated by a couple of early 2000s posters of women in bikinis posing with cars. Somyat was smiling ear to ear and waved me over. He opened a safe under his desk and pulled out a small box of white pill bottles. They were all sealed and unmarked, except for a small blue sunflower print on the cap. He sat me down and took a bottle out of his pocket to show me. "This is gonna help," he said. "Trust me." "I don't do drugs, boss." "I know you don't. This isn't that." He showed me his phone and a conversation he'd had with the guy from the party, the one from the research institute. Apparently, he'd managed to get his hands on a couple of cases of an off-market stimulant. "I tried it myself," he said. "Going on 2 weeks now, it's a little miracle." "What does it do? What's the catch?" "No need to sleep anymore," he smiled. "1 pill, you're good for at least 18 hours. No way. You might need another hour or two to recover when you finally go to bed, but apart from that, it's perfect. Doesn't make your piss smell, doesn't fuck up your hair, nothing." "No way," I repeated. Too good to be true. Somyat sat down at his desk across from me, giving me a long look. "You won't let me get you a better job," he said. "Let me get you this." As a friend, I could tell he was being genuine. You could say a lot about Somyat, but he'd always been honest with me. I swallowed my fears and picked up one of the pills. "I don't know," I said. "There's got to be a catch." "Never more than 1 a day," he said, "or you'll get sick, and no more than 2 days at a time. Maybe 3, but then you'll probably get a headache. Oh, and no drugs." "What do you mean?" "There's a list of things drugs it reacts with, but you don't do that stuff, so you're good." "What about caffeine?" "As long as you don't pour stuff like..." Somyat picked up a small piece of paper and looked it over, reading from a list. "Arecoline, cocaine hydrochloride, diacetylmorphine, or methamphetamine, you're good." There goes my Friday night. "Funny," Somyat scoffed. "If you don't want it, it's fine, but..." No, I'll try one." And so I did. Taking that first pill was like breathing in after a deep dive. I felt lighter, but not high. I was just well rested, ready to take on the day. But there was also a slight chill to it, like a cold breath sweeping across my nerves. I looked at Somyat like I was seeing him for the first time. He got up and slapped his hands together with a grin. "I knew it," he said. "I knew this'd be it." "How much?" I asked. "For a bottle, how much?" "Take it," he smiled, pushing over the whole case. "Guy owed me a favor." "Really, you're just giving it away?" "I'm just glad to have a friend." That night was the first time I stuck around to party with Somyat for real. The man was a force of nature. He'd down shots like they were water. He knew all the best food vendors on the block by name, and he'd ping-pong from after-party to after-party without breaking a sweat. I was just along for the ride. We ended up drunk on a bench watching the sunrise. Not a blink of tiredness in our eyes. Our day was just getting started. No need for beetle nuts to keep us going. I wouldn't need those ever again. "Next, you're getting a woman," he murmured. "Then a job, a great job. You can fix anything, huh? That's why I'm the boss." "I don't want to owe you anything," I said. "You get that, right? You don't owe me anything." "Kind of feels like I do." He asked me to show him my phone. I did, and he scrolled down to his number on the contact list. He tapped it, hovering his finger over the delete button. "You can delete me today and never call me again, and that's up to you." "Really?" "Really." He handed me the phone back and turned his attention to the sun. "But for as long as you feel like it, I'm here," he continued. "No strings." "No strings?" He shrugged and slid his final beer my way. "It's just nice to be the good guy for once." The next night, lying in my bed, I was scared. I had no idea how my body would respond. It was a make-or-break moment where I'd find out if Somyat had screwed me over, or if he'd really helped me out. I had a whole case of those pills stashed away in the closet, more than enough to keep me going for months. But I took his advice. Every 2 or 3 days or so, I'd give it a rest. So when I went to sleep that night, I didn't know what to expect. I had strange dreams. I dreamt I woke up in this barren world, with a dead tree towering in the distance. There were no stars in the sky. It was desolate, but peaceful in a way. And I dreamt that there was someone there in the dark, someone looking for me. But I woke up long before they found me. I was a bit worked up, but it was just a dream. Those fleeting images rolled out of my mind faster than it took for me to make breakfast. From that moment on, I decided to give these things a go. I would rest every 3 days or so, but until then, I was constantly on the go. I could work as many hours as I wanted. I could be up all night finishing projects left and right. I never missed a call from Isara. I could keep up with demands, and I could do it comfortable, without side effects. Sure, whenever I crashed, I'd dream about that place again. The dead tree reaching for the moon, the desolate ruins, and somewhere out in the eternal night, something was looking for me. But it never had the time to find me. I'd always wake up long before it did. It was comfortable, efficient, and I could do it all. I had time to work a little with Somyat. Not anything big, just odd jobs here and there. He was fair but didn't pay much, but then again I was making more money than I knew how to spend. I got a second chance at an interview with Somyat's guy at the Research Institute, and that time around, I nailed it. It was just a low-level data entry job, but I could do it remotely, and it paid almost twice as much as my delivery job. I had to brush up on my English, but that wasn't a big deal. Izara and I had to learn it early on in our lives. My mother made sure of it. Izara had saved up enough money for her cosmetology classes, so I got some more time to focus on other things. I invested some time in a startup app with some guys from my classes, and we made some solid progress. Overall, things looked pretty good. Weeks turned to months, and months eventually turned to an entire year. I still had plenty of pills left, and I got into a healthy routine. I slept better, I ate better, and I had so much more time on my hands. It got to the point where I couldn't imagine going back to life without those pills. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what that place in between the wakeful world and my dreams was. That place in the starless night, with the dead tree in the distance. Who were the dark shapes roaming the fields of black sand? And who was out there looking at me? I wouldn't think about it too much. I chalked it up as a weird side effect, but not much else. It didn't affect my everyday life, so why should I care? Fast forward to 2023. I was co-owner of a small company. No more data entry. We had an office and 5 employees. My nickname still stuck around, but it was more or less sarcastic. I was no longer the guy who showed up at the end of it all. I was the first in line. I would plan my come-downs in a way that people never noticed. I had this reputation of working around the clock, and people just couldn't figure it out. I didn't share my secret with anyone. I figured there would be some serious consequences if those pills got in the wrong hands. My sister got a nice job at one of the local malls. One of the really big ones, not just any old mall. It was very well paid, and she could support herself more than enough. She ended up moving in with a guy, and I got a place of my own. I could finally take a step up and get myself something nice. I still spent time with Somyat. He was the only other person in the world that knew of the pills. He'd stopped taking them, though. He found them too distracting when it came to keeping a schedule. He was going steady with a lady named Wanwan, and he hated seeing her go to bed on her own. It was surprisingly sweet. And more pills for me, so win-win. In February of 2023, my sister got married. It was bad timing, since I had a huge project to work on at the time. So even with all my available time, it was still not enough. So I had to do something Somyat advised against. I had to keep going for 5 days straight. Just 2 days more than the ordinary 3, but still. Now, I didn't immediately notice anything. It worked just fine. But when I finally crashed, after almost a full week without sleep, I had the most awful nightmare of my life. Not only was I back there, in that desolate space, I could feel it. The black sand creeping into my shoes. The howling of people in pain. I thought I heard gunfire, too. What little vegetation lived there was twisted into a midnight blue, just like the blue sunflower on the cap of the bottle. But this time there wasn't just something in the dark looking for me. No, it was hunting. I have this vivid memory of crawling through the sands of an old ruin, hearing something closing in. Despite the sand, it was wet, viscous. It made this disgusting sound like a crowd of large men struggling for breath all at once. I would hear it touch its way across the ruins looking for me, and everywhere it touched, something sizzled like burning acid. It tried to speak, I know it did, but it couldn't. It had too many tongues, and they all tried to speak at once. Eventually it found me. I couldn't look. I couldn't breathe. I could feel the size of it without even looking as it loomed over me. I tried making myself small, but it didn't matter. It sighed, like it had enjoyed a cold glass of water on a warm summer's day. It was so pleased to find me, and as it moved closer, I heard something dripping, sizzling into the sand. There was a powerful smell of ammonia and something akin to mothballs. It touched my arm and it burned into my skin. It burned so bad that I woke up, and when I did, I had a burn. A coin-sized black mark with gangrenous flesh tightening the skin of the arm, stinging with every flex of my triceps. That place was real. That thing had been real. For a full week after that, I kept feeling like I'd been seconds from death. I had a doctor check out my arm, but he couldn't make sense of it. It was an acid burn, but it behaved like a frostbite. In the end, he had to make a small procedure to remove the necrotized skin, but it was overall fine. I just had to keep it clean and bandaged, and be prepared for a nasty scar. But that thing had been so vivid. Days later, I could still smell it. I remember this one time when I was taking a shower when I had to turn off the water. I thought I heard something sizzling in the other room. Wrapped in a towel, I peeked through the door, hoping against hope that I was just being paranoid. That time I was. But what about next time? I swore off the pills. I was in a good place and I didn't need them anymore. I'd gained everything I wanted. Sure, it'd take some time to get back to a normal schedule, but I couldn't go back there. No wonder we weren't supposed to take more than 2 or 3 pills in a sequence. If I'd been there a second longer, it would have taken my whole arm. Another hour and I'd be dead. I decided to give it all back to Somyat. By that time, he had expanded his business a bit, but he'd calmed down as a person. He was a changed man. He was engaged to Wanwan, and he was trying to turn his life around. In fact, we hadn't seen each other for some time. He was a bit surprised when I called about meeting him in his office. I met Somyat in his downtown office late one Friday night. It was a strange feeling. There were people everywhere, but I still felt like I was alone. There was this thought crawling around in the back of my head, whispering to me that if I slowed down and really listened, I could hear that sizzling acid as it burned into the asphalt. So I kept my head down and tried to get into the music, the bass, the beat of the party, but it was all just superficial. I couldn't help but think back on that thing. Every time I heard a cough, a sneeze, someone clearing their throat, I thought that was it. It found me. I could feel the squelch of it in my ear, almost like a heat. But I made my way through the club and joined Somyat in his office. I put the pills on his desk and sat down across from him. "I'm done with them," I said. "They do something to you?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, I'm done." "All right, no worries." Somyat nodded. "You okay?" "Not really." Despite not hanging out for a while, Somyat was his usual self. He put the pills away, sat down next to me, and handed me a beer. He'd installed a mini fridge next to his desk. The damn thing made more noise than his ceiling fan. "I'm not gonna ask about it," he said. "You look like shit." "I feel like shit." "What happened to your arm?" "Frostbite." Somyat snorted but saw that I wasn't laughing. He opened his mouth but closed it again. Whatever had happened to me, he knew better than to laugh. Instead, he leaned over, looking worried. "Fuck the pills," he said. "You're sticking with me now, all right?" "All right." He made his best effort to keep me company that night. We had drinks, met some people, and sang some karaoke. I almost got into an arm wrestling competition with a drunk Dutch guy. It was nice, and for a moment I didn't hear those awful noises. I didn't smell those smells. Later that night, I could feel myself growing tired. Usually, I would pop one of the pills, but I settled for a classic instead, beetle nuts. Somyat and I wrapped them up and bit down. It was nice to feel that familiar crunch and burn. It was a return to form in a way. It was the way things were supposed to be. By the end of the night, we ended up on that same bench watching the sun, but this time he was exhausted. He was nodding off over and over as he waited for a friend to pick him up. I was, strangely, not tired in the slightest. "Maybe you still got some of it in your system," Somyat mumbled. Makes sense, right? Bigger doses take longer. Probably, I nodded. Or maybe it was the nuts. Nah, they don't work like that. They're a kick, not a trip. By the time Somyot's friend came around to pick him up, he could barely keep his eyes open. He lumbered into the passenger seat and looked back at me one final time. I'm getting rid of them, he said. Don't worry, it's done. You'll be fine. But I wasn't feeling fine. Or rather, I was. But that was the problem. I went home and I still couldn't sleep. I went an entire day and I still couldn't sleep. I hadn't taken any pills for some time, but I was still up and about. I was getting worried, but I didn't know where to turn. Had I taken a pill by accident? I reached out to Somyot's contact at the research institute, but we couldn't talk about it over email since it was monitored and this was hardly legal. So we decided to meet downtown later in the week. For the next few days, I was a wreck. I kept thinking about that place and that thing. I'd been up for so many days that I didn't want to think about what would happen when I returned. It would be waiting for me. I could feel it, hear it. I met the man from the research institute in early morning. I paid for his coffee, but I didn't get any myself. He was an American in his 50s with a shaved head and a well-trimmed goatee. He hid behind a black baseball cap and wasn't much for small talk. I decided to get right to it. I explained the problem. After taking a larger than usual dose, I couldn't sleep anymore. He didn't look that surprised. That only happens when you take stimulants, he said. Didn't he warn you? I haven't taken anything, I said. I don't do drugs. You sure? He asked. Nothing. Does alcohol count? I asked. Betel nuts, caffeine? What? No, that... He stopped for a second. His eyes turned away as he thought about it. He brought out his phone and checked something, then nodded. Betel nuts, he repeated. That's high in arecoline. High in what? Arecoline. That's the first thing on the list. That's the worst one. Wait, what? He adjusted his glasses and read the list out loud. He was right. Arecoline was the first thing on the list, right there next to hard narcotics. What does it mean? I asked. What's going to happen? He leaned back in his chair, sipped his coffee, and adjusted his glasses. We made this in our lab back in Vietnam. When the lab got shut down, it was scheduled to be burned, but we never got around to it. So you make drugs? Is that it? It's not a drug, he explained. It isolates a particular chemical element. It was originally made to nurture a type of deep-sea fish to gestate a kind of rough metal powder. What? Fish? I don't... Look, it's not a stimulant. It's not a drug. It puts a part of you in another place, and while it's there, your body becomes disconnected from a few of your basic needs. In most cases, sleep. So what does it mean? What's going to happen to me? He leaned forward, looking over the edge of his silver-rimmed glasses. Arecoline amplifies the effect by a magnitude of about 100. It's one of the reasons they had to shut down the development. At that magnitude, there's no telling what's going to happen. Wait, 100? So I'm going to... You're going to be awake for maybe a year, maybe 4. And then something I can't even imagine is going to happen to you. There was nothing else to say. He had no advice to give. There were no solutions. The damage was done. I almost burst into tears right then and there. My hands were shaking. I would be awake for years and then... Something. Something he couldn't even imagine. If the effect of 2 pills too many caught me a burn on the arm, what the hell was going to happen after 100, 200? The bandage itched and I could hear the sizzling from a nearby kitchen. But it wasn't from the kitchen. It was that thing. And it was waiting for me. It was just a matter of time. I tried everything, but there was nothing to be done. There was nothing wrong with me, on paper. I was healthier than ever, in fact. The lab in Vietnam that the man spoke of had been shut down, and all traces of it was dismantled. I had a vague lead to an investor in the US, but it didn't lead me anywhere. I had to sell my share in the company. It stung, but the payout was more than generous. It would keep me afloat for a couple of months, maybe a year, while I tried to work something out. But it was a desperate search for nothing. Even the man from the research institute would drop off the grid. And when strange men in suits started asking my friends and family about me, I knew I'd taken a step too far. This was in February 2023. Every day from that point forward has been a nightmare. In May that same year, I lost the need to eat. It's like my body entered a kind of metastasis. I could sit in a room for days on end, staring at a wall, and nothing would change. I would feel nothing. I would experience nothing. And I wouldn't care. and with no food, I'd need no bathroom breaks. Sometime in July, I lost the need to breathe. I would forget to do it for days on end, and my lungs would deflate to the point where it hurt to use them. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't talk without bleeding anymore. In late October that year, I stopped blinking. I would forget to do it for long periods of time, and dust would settle in my eyes. It didn't hurt, but it was uncomfortable to wash them, so I just ended up keeping them closed. Something happened to my skin. I think it stopped needing sunlight. Over a couple of days, I grew so pale you could almost see through me. My fingernails would fall off. Without using my mouth and jaw, my teeth fell out of my skull. I barely noticed. I had to move in with my sister to care for me. She couldn't understand what was happening, and neither could anyone else. She would force me to go to the doctors, and they couldn't make sense of it. Whenever they mentioned specialists, some anonymous group would throw enough money at them to look the other way. But all of that was just cake topping. It was all just physical things. It didn't compare to my thoughts and feelings. I would feel closer and closer to that dark place, that space beyond where that thing waited for me. It hungered for me. All the needs and wants I'd lost, it had gained. It was hungry, tired, sunburnt, and in constant pain. And it wanted to give it all back to me, to consume me with it. If I just listened hard enough, I could hear it panting, like an eager dog waiting for master to put food in his bowl, ready to tear into me, unashamed. Sometimes I forget what world I'm in. I'll get up and wander around, feeling the walls, imagining them as crumbling ruins. My sister once caught me wandering into the street. If my lungs had worked, she would have heard me begging that thing to leave me. Instead, I got hit by a car, and I didn't feel a thing, laying crumbled into a pile by the side of the road. The things people say feel like a distant dream. I have no need for serotonin, so joy is something of the past. Sometimes I can hear the music and cheering across the city, but it feels like they're mocking me. But the fear, that's still there. It may be the only emotion that remains. Now it's 2025. I think I attended Somyat's wedding, but I can't know for sure. I think I was there. I didn't see or hear. I can't feel anything when I move my arms anymore. There was a nice smell. I think he offered me some cake. I tried to smile at him, but I don't know if I did it. I've written this with great effort over several weeks. My sister has helped. She washes my eyes, and I would look at the letters for her to type. If I stretch a little, I can get enough air in my lungs to make a noise or a short word. Sometimes at night, when my sister is not here, I think I can hear something outside. Not just in my mind, but on the street. I think they are watching me. I think they're curious about what happens when I got to sleep, or maybe they're scared. It's funny in a way. They called me Lurk, closing time. It's fitting. I can't help but think I should have stayed with my father, maintaining farm equipment. I wish I could dream of seeing those pale green walls again. I had to finish this in a hurry. I think the effect is wearing off, like the man said it would. Yesterday I yawned. Today I'm tired. Good night, Bangkok. A few months ago, I started taking walks at night. I had not been getting out much since I started my new job, rented a place in a nice, calm part of town, and finally got my life something resembling together, after a long period of drifting aimlessly. My whole life, really, paying the bills on a spacious studio apartment meant sinking every moment I had into work and chores, and I was starting to feel the restlessness that always came to me after too much time spent in cubicles and walls that started closing in on me no matter how nice the wallpaper. And I needed to get out. It was a nice change of pace, having some time to myself to process and grab a smoke while looking at a clear sky full of stars. My idea of going out used to be getting trashed and spending the next day recovering so I could do it all over again. But I was getting used to crisp air and listening to the thoughts in my head for once, even if they're sometimes biting. It's a nice neighborhood, like I said, with lots of rustic houses lit up by string lights in the gardens, and a few apartment buildings like my own strewn about, so I'm never scared to wander as late as I want, listening to some new album I haven't had the time to catch up on, or trusty old Cure if nothing else. There are never very many people out this time of year, which makes it peaceful, and the occasional dog walker or late shift worker always shares a friendly smile, and I'm left to stroll the tiny park areas, enjoying the way nighttime always makes everything more cinematic and moody than the gray daylight of autumn. Slowly, I've mapped out the entire area on my lazy strolls, taking this way or that, venturing into new, winding streets and always finding something picturesque to see. an unfamiliar greenhouse, or a frosty duck pond. I'm not entirely familiar with the area just yet to where I don't sometimes get a little lost, but I've got a pretty good sense of direction and I'm getting there. Sounds idyllic, I can hear you say. Why am I relating about this boring stuff? Well, the other night I found a house I'd never seen before. It was a regular house, it is a regular house, perfectly ordinary and normal, if a little out of place with its stark white paint among the red-tiled and wooden-knotted styles of the rest of the neighborhood. But there's all kinds nestled in there. My favorite is a gray-stained one with a roof the size and sharpness of an old church, and a yellow, almost Victorian-style one with a little turret. I couldn't tell you why the white-painted house stuck out to me, or why a strange feeling made my skin crawl when I saw it. I just knew it felt unpleasant. It's situated at the end of a bend in the road, where the woods behind it meet a highway far away behind the thick of pine trees, and it stands just a little distant to the rest of the neighborhood. The streetlights stop reaching because there's nothing to light up over there. They're doing some construction at the end of the road that looks perpetually not in progress, just scraps of metal and hardware stacked and waiting, and it's the one area of the neighborhood that doesn't feel homely. Maybe that's what got to me. That sort of liminal feeling that only industrial structures at night give you. In any case, after the first time it caught my eye, I started walking past it every time I went out. I don't know why. Oddities have always drawn me in, and there's a pleasant little rush in finding strange things at a safe distance. This tiny 5-minute moment every night that would intrigue me at the start of my walk and get the gears going in my head for some short story or other before I turned back to my quaint neighborhood. There's something wrong with that house, I'd think every time I passed it, smiling a little at my own silliness. It's too still, too stark somehow. Why are the lights never on? Frankly, it was a good question. Even though I'd start walking in the evening, I still had to get up in the morning, so it wasn't like I was out there at 3 a.m. or anything. And the lights were always on in every other house I'd see. Someone would be preparing for bed, watching TV lazily in the living room, scraping the leftovers from their dinner into a container in the kitchen. I like watching people. I like throwing quick glances at windows, catching glimpses of their day-to-day. I live a mostly solitary life, and there's something fascinating to me about people, their habits and their things, their choice of bookshelves and lamps and pictures lining their walls, the life they've accumulated over the years and inhabit daily without thinking about it. It says so much about them, these boxes they live in, their places of safety. I've always felt like a solitary observer of everyone around me, taking quiet notes of little details like that. An explorer in a strange world of domesticity I've never had myself. Put it like that, maybe I'm just lonely. In any case, this house had none of that. Nothing for me to see, to analyze, and turn to stories in my head. If there was furniture, I couldn't see it because these people went to bed at 8 every night, and there was nothing on the front lawn, not even a car or a watering hose, just well-kept green grass that felt bare-boned somehow. Like someone doing the very least of the concept of living. Like someone playing house with no imagination. Listen, I'm an overthinker, so take all of this with a grain of salt. I guess that's why I kept obsessing over it. Why I kept wandering by first at the start of my route, and then sometimes to finish, trying to get anything out of that place at all. Any semblance of personality, of that essence that any other home would give me. Who were the people that lived there? You'd think no one did, but someone kept that lawn well maintained. Someone would periodically open and close the blinds on the second floor. I walked by it once in daylight before work, and the blinds in one small window were closed where they had been open the night before, so someone had to have done that. Still no lights on, and the windows were just dark and empty as usual, contrasted by the pristine white paint, as if daylight just couldn't penetrate that place. A child's drawing of a house before they'd gotten bored and wandered off, not bothering to fill in those classical awkward squares for curtains and crude flower pots. Just emptiness. Interesting to me, because emptiness like that isn't easily achieved. We leave some kind of traces of ourselves everywhere, whether we like to or not, simply by living. Even the trees outside were anonymous. No fruit or markings on the bark, no tree houses, no decorations, just trees in the most basic sense of the word. It made me think of a poem I liked, when all you need to know of a place is, do people live there? If they do, you know everything. I felt like I knew nothing. Not about the house, nor its inhabitants. Nothing about life in general, to be honest. Who keeps a whole house just to visit on occasion? What house would stay uninhabited for long, especially such a spacious one in such a charming neighborhood? Someone had to live there, but they seemed to never be there, and I'm sure that once this thought hit you, you'd also be intrigued. Maybe not as much as me, but you haven't been there. You haven't felt the nothingness. I like horror. I love horror, actually. It's my favorite genre when it comes to films, books, games, you name it. Creepy podcasts about monsters from folklore, unsettling historical facts about torture and plagues, even just unsolved stories like the Dyatlov Pass is my jam. And I've read every creepypasta under the sun. It's been a rough time in my life lately, before I finally got this job, and my last relationship was a train wreck I still haven't recovered from and maybe never will. I haven't been sleeping well, ever really. I romanticize things to cope with my fucked up childhood, and I've always made up little stories in my head to make the world around me seem less daunting or more exciting, or just to be anywhere else than where I am. I've been on antidepressants since July, the same kind my mother used to take. The same kind of ghosts that plague my mind also haunted hers. I'm telling you all of this to be fully honest, so you know that I have a vivid imagination, that I try to escape the pressing bleakness of reality as much as I can, that I'm not doing well and never really have. So you know, that I'm an unreliable narrator. It feels important, it feels clean, that you know as well as me that it all could have been a trick of my mind, that it all could have a perfectly reasonable, normal explanation. Though I still can't explain what happened that night. I still don't really understand. I was walking a little later than usual, nearer to midnight, because it was a Friday and I didn't have work the next day. But I'd had a mess of a work day earlier. The kind that never seems to end, where things just keep stacking up and everything around you that usually runs smoothly keeps failing, until you think you'll never get out. I finally escaped sometime after 8, and got home to make dinner in a pissed-off mood and burnt that too. It was just one of those days. My walks were sanctuary, though, and I still dragged my ass out into the crisp air after lying around feeling sorry for myself on the couch for a bit, finding nothing good to watch on the TV and hitting every wrong note on my beat-up guitar. To amuse myself, as usual, I decided to take a tour of the house. Since my discovery of it, it has permanently become the house capital letters in my mind. An entity, my own private little Scooby Gang mystery, the world's most boring horror story, where the only horror was the absence of things instead of anything horrific that was actually there. Well, until that night anyway. That night I saw something finally in the little window where the blinds would move where nothing else did. An outline, a shape, almost imperceptible in the dark, but unmistakably there. Remember, this is not a spooky neighborhood, and there are still streetlights somewhere in the distance and a neighboring house, even if it's farther away than usual. There was just enough light from the outside to make out that shape in the window, and I didn't immediately find it unsettling. It's a damned weird house in my mind, but I can still understand the difference between what's real and what isn't. At least I think I can. I'm not so sure anymore. Oh, someone does live there, was my immediate thought. There goes the theory that it's uninhabited or for sale. My second thought, after getting a little closer, was, are they looking at me? I couldn't tell because the shape in the window was all black, something just a little darker than its surrounding. The blinds were pulled all the way up, fully exposing the glass of it, and behind it I could just see someone vaguely human-shaped. Long hair when I got closer. I think they were looking at me because I've never felt so watched in my whole life. So seen, so exposed. I can't explain it because how could I, but it was that prickly feeling up the back of your neck, hair-raising thing that you sometimes get. And then you turn around and someone who was watching you at the bus stop or coming up behind you on a running trail appears, and you think nothing of it. It happens, just an old reflex from more animalistic times. It was that, but turned up 1,000,000 times stronger. Unbearable almost. More like what a deer caught in headlights must feel just before the car hits and breaks their bones. I got closer. The shape didn't move. I walked all the way up beside the house where the road bends, and the shape did not move. Did not fix anything in the window because there was nothing to fix. Didn't fiddle with the blinds. Didn't turn away when they saw me approach and stare. Just stood there, perfectly still as the rest of that house, as still as everything in that weird bubble universe of a garden. Thinking about it then, I realized I'd never seen the trees sway in any breeze. It stood there as if its only purpose was to stand there. It stood there as if it was waiting for something. It stood there as if it was waiting for me. I walked by. What the hell else was I supposed to do? Stay there, staring back like a freak? People are allowed to stand in their windows. They're allowed to do whatever they want in their homes. I was the weirdo out there, making up nonsense because my mind won't ever shut up, and no matter what I felt was irrelevant. I walked by because I was scared. I couldn't get home fast enough, all the time feeling like that watched feeling never left me, that thing boring its gaze into the back of neck. I don't know why I thought of it as a thing. It was a person, clearly, but it was a person as much as that house was a house. Rudimentarily, barely, emptily. I got home and I drank 3 beers, not giving a shit about the warnings on my meds, and fell asleep watching something stupid on TV. Some boring talk show about local politics droning me into sleep with its mundanity. You'd think I had nightmares, that my spooky brain would take this fucked up event and turn it into a feast of horrors, but I didn't dream anything. I woke up and the space between the previous night and late morning was entirely empty to me. Not the kind of blackout you get from being drunk, not that. I've had my fair share of those over the years, and this wasn't blissful darkness. I still had the inexplicable feeling that I had dreamt, that I had been somewhere, the way you go to places in your mind when you dream and understand that time has passed, but that the place was a nothing where something should have been. Just emptiness. Just the house, I suppose. It was still enough to amuse me. I don't scare easily. You don't get through the kind of shit I've been through by being easily scared. People do. Memories sometimes, that cloying feeling of pathological unwellness that rots you from the inside. The hard truths in life do. Like the fact that sometimes the people who love you the most will cut you the deepest because they just can't help themselves. Not people in windows, not scary stories, not made-up things. Not the things that should scare me that are designed to. Real intimacy, now that's fucking terrifying if you ask me. This question mark. This was funny, it was exciting. It was something that wasn't boring and mundane when everything else seemed to be, and honestly I couldn't wait to go back. Now I know why people in horror movies act like idiots. Because they are, because they're fucked up, because we all have something in our heads that won't let us rest. Because we never quite outgrow that urge to touch a hot stove just to see what happens. Just to feel our skin sizzle a little. Some of us don't even have anyone to teach us not to. Some of us have our hands pressed against the burner and held there, and we learn to like it. So back I went. I pretended to have a whole Saturday full of things that normal people do. Washing clothes and dishes and catching up on some vacuuming, taking a long bath and reading a magazine, messing around on the computer for a bit. All the while pretending like I wasn't waiting, like I wasn't in standby mode until nighttime, when I would go back to that house and maybe catch a glimpse of my watcher again. More realistically, see nothing, and realize that I didn't even see anything the night before. To be honest, I'd also had a beer with dinner, maybe 2, I don't recall. Actually, I'd like not to recall, but I know. As soon as time came around the same time as the night before, I was out the door and lighting up a smoke, saying hello to the rare neighbor on their way to town to have a pub night with friends or the like. It really is a sleepy little place, and I'm glad because too much noise and hustle drives me crazy. I hated living in the city. Here I feel like a ghost, a dark, ill-fitting shape of something that's awkwardly settled into an easier life, a vampire in retirement, out of place but content. The house was, of course, where it always was, waiting for me. Blank, pale face with black, unseeing eyes, nothing in the window. I remember actually sighing, in relief of disappointment, I'm not sure which, and so I stood there in the dark, by the still trees and my still empty house and felt a little dejected. A little stupid. I lit a cigarette and smoked for a bit, still enjoying the vast night, the moon and the stars. I cheered myself up by thinking that it was the weekend after all, and I could play some guitar when I came home. Maybe call my friend I haven't heard from in ages and see if she was doing better. I stood there for a while, finishing my cigarette and lighting another, fiddling with my phone. Maybe I was waiting, truth be told. I was selecting an album to play and stubbing the cigarette out on the ground, and in that movement I saw it, out of the corner of my eye. The shape. It was standing there again, so still and so dark, and the prickly feeling at the back of my neck came back. I was pretty close to the house, closer than I'd ever gotten before, almost to the gate, and I suppose I wouldn't have heard the blinds open. It's a small noise, but I think I might have. I should have. I have really good hearing. Hypervigilance, my doctor calls it. Attuned to a pin drop on the floor above me sometimes. To the smallest cough, to what feels like people's thoughts sometimes. It's the world's most annoying superpower, and I always have to plug my ears to get any sleep if I don't manage to focus on something lulling from the TV. I could hear the faint sounds of music from the house way up the street, and the highway was a muffled buzz masked by the woods. And I could hear all these things as clearly as I always can. But I didn't hear the blinds open. Even though I was just a few feet from the source, it's... whatever, that's normal. I don't know why I'm focusing on that right now. I'd periodically been looking up at the house, at the window, and a minute ago the blinds that had been closed were open and the shape was there. It was looking at me. I knew it was looking at me. I stood there, frozen for a while, staring up at the thing staring at me, wondering if I was losing my mind with the detached amusement that thought always brings me. And then I shook my head to snap myself out of it. And the thing shook its head too. It shook its head like I had shaken mine, black hair swaying a little, and I felt oddly sick. I don't know why. That deer in the headlights feeling was more of a mouse in the lights of semi-truck strong, and I felt calm. I know that doesn't make sense with everything else I'm telling you here, but it's what I felt. Something had gone still inside of me, completely still and empty. It crept into me like a foreign force, like something outside of me, winding its tendrils from the dark and into my body. It wasn't mine. It came from the house. I walked up a step. I walked another step, until I was pressed against the gate, against the unusually tall rails that looked almost like prison bars in the shadows, until my hands were pressed against them and I tried my hardest to squint, to see. It was useless. There was no light. There was no light at all, and there was none coming from the street lights that were too far away, or the house up the road that was closest, and it didn't reach here, and that wasn't why I could see the shape. I don't know why I thought that was why I could see it the night before. I don't know why I thought that when the light was coming from behind it. Only the light wasn't light. It was more an absence of dark. Just slightly lesser than the dark of the rest of that fucking damn place. And I could see the shape because it wanted me to see it. I tilted my head, trying to make sense of it. It tilted its head. At the same time. No latency. I ran. There's no way around it. I hightailed out if there was something chasing me. I'm not a complete moron. There's still some survival skills left in me, rusty as they may be. I ran all the way home, up the stairs, and slammed the door behind me, gasping for air against it. My lungs spasmed, and I had a stitch in my side. I should really stop smoking, I thought. I did all the things I said I would do the night before. I cooked, I cleaned, and I called my friend. She seemed far away in that way she always is, but she was glad to hear from me. She let me rattle on about my job and how awful I found it really, in my heart of hearts. And the new apartment that makes it all worth it, makes me feel like a new person. Someone decent and respectable and all those things I told myself once that I didn't need, but secretly crave somewhere inside all along. It was good to speak to her, good to laugh a little about stupid things. She did seem better. I could hear it in her voice and the way she spoke about the new succulents she had just bought, about how she looked forward to the coming spring, and how it would bring with it some much-needed sunshine. I hope she stays that way. I hope she stays clean this time. I stayed away from any mention of the house, pushing it down to the deepest recesses of my mind, where it laid festering like an infected wound all the same. I remained in some strange way frozen all day, having a hard time making any simple decisions, from how to fold the laundry to what to drink in the evening. Coffee or tea? Coffee would keep me up, give me energy for the night. It wouldn't let me sleep though, and I knew I needed rest more than anything. I chose coffee, and already then I must have known. The whole day had been a state of denial. Each task I set up for myself was another way to bargain, to plead for one more moment of normalcy before the inevitable came. I knew I was going back. I was going on another excursion to my wooden-boarded haunt. There had never really been a choice at all. It was early November back then, and the late-night air blew chilly, chapping the skin of my face and hands. I didn't care. All I wanted was another look at it. The house was waiting for me, so serene against the backdrop of the woods in the distance, with its knotted fingers of elm tree and birch reaching crookedly up toward the sky. There were no clouds that night. I remember because I kept glancing up at all the constellations I knew, the stars that make up Ursa Minor, leading me on my way like foreboding points of candlelight on black velvet. My due north when I had none inside of me. The house was as always, a too bright artifact in the night, something exhumed and proclaimed holy by a superstitious mind, like Stonehenge or a small pyramid in the desert of suburbia. I think that just for a moment as it first came into view, I felt a strange sense of longing, of love, the way you love poisonous things that hurt you, but apologize after. Something that sinks its claws into you while making you feel cherished all the while. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the feeling passed, and it was just a house again. No one's home but a pile of wood and concrete. My feet found their way up the road toward it on their own accord. I wanted to go back to my apartment where there was warmth and some soup in the fridge to eat, but they were not in agreement with me. This time my figure was waiting for me. Not only that, but it was outside. Next to the little shed in the backyard of the house, the figure stood unnaturally still, as only something from another reality could. Not a single hair blown here nor there by the wind, not a twitch of its thin, sharp limbs. It just stood there, absorbing all light like a long, dark tunnel leading nowhere, the kind that feels almost creepy to pass through on a highway stretch. As I approached, I was hit by that strange feeling again, prickling the back of my neck, telling me I was doing something stupid. I had to agree with enthusiasm. I felt watched, picked apart, dissected by this creature's pitch-black, blank eyes. They glowed the faintest ember in the dim starlight, unsettling like a pair of blood moons, and it made me want to snuff them out somehow. They followed me as I came closer, squinting in the dark. It stood by a swing set, one I'd never seen before. A basic, rusty construction with 2 seats that looked uncomfortable just to look at. It made me think of the ones I'd had as a child in the crappy neighborhood I'd grown up in. Another children's drawing approximation of something that could actually be used. I stood there for a while, and the figure didn't move until my phone started vibrating. My friend calling me this time. And once I'd fumbled my phone off, it was gone. I looked up and saw nothing, like it had never been there at all. It wasn't a very eventful meeting. What scared me most was the air of expectation around the thing, as if it had been waiting for me for a while. What scared me most was the notion that I had been about to sit down on one of those swings had we not been interrupted. The recognition in its holes for eyes. During the next couple of days, I kept on taking excursions to the house. Every time I told myself I'd stop, that I had better things to do, something profoundly creepy would happen. Some bad omen or other that brought me right back to the cursed place like a moth to flame. Once I saw nothing but a cat crossing the road, over to the eerie construction lot on the other side, but it was a strange approximation of such a creature that it stopped me dead in my tracks. The cat was sleek, sharp, and moved with animatronic precision, and I know that makes it sound like any other feline, but I swear this one seemed to be even more aware of its surroundings than other cats I knew of. It moved with the utmost of nonchalant indifference, yet I could tell its eyes were fixated on me as it made its fast track to the scrap heap down the road, and I got this weird feeling that it wanted me to follow. I didn't, because I know the rules of horror pretty well, and following that little demon underneath a sheet of metal was not on the list of survivor moves. But I kind of wanted to. I had some feeling that my fate would be decided there in the dark, and the morbid curiosity I felt made me feel almost feverish with it. Later, I would think back on the time I saw a cat cross a road and laugh about it. How terrifying I would chuckle. What would I even call the incident to convey the true horror of it? The curious case of the fast-moving cat? It was all nonsense. Still, it scared me off for a few days after that one. It was the closest to something living I had come across at that place. Something else would happen as soon as I plucked up the courage to go back there, and live inside my head for ages as I turned it over, trying to make sense of it. There is a shed behind the house. Rather, sometimes there is a shed. When I first discovered it, there was nothing but the manicured lawn behind it, stretching far beyond its fenced-off borders, flowerless and almost neon green. The third time I passed, a small shed sat off to the side, looking old and worn as if it had been there for eons. It was the same unassuming white color as the house, only much more weathered and fraying. It looked at me with its one window like an eye, just like that cat, observing me as I passed, open and lidless. It was just one large square window turned on its side, the corners pointed like a star. There was no door, nothing through which you could enter into the black hole inside, no doubt waiting to swallow you whole. I shivered as I passed it. I knew that it was staring right at me, following me with its one sole access to vision, and what is it they say about abysses? I kept my gaze resolutely on the ground in front of me, ignoring the same old feeling of being studied, by a shed of all things, even though that familiar feeling of paranoia festered inside of me like a wound. I'd never felt so seen, and just like the figure in the window, the shed made me afraid to be trapped somehow. I knew, despite the fact that there seemed to be no entrance into it, as soon as I stepped foot inside, that would be it. No going back from the decision to enter what was surely another realm, a hellscape beyond even my imagination. I had this thought that it was beyond it because there was nothing to imagine, that the stark lack of assault to my senses would be worse than any horror I could come up with. Imagine being trapped forever in nothing. It made me sick with fear. I've seen that shed pop in and out of existence since. Sometimes it's behind the house, hiding somewhere off to the side, sometimes in front of it. Sometimes it's nowhere to be found. Those times worry me the most. Whatever it's up to, I can't imagine that it's doing any good. I had honestly lost my mind a little at this point. Sometimes I swore I saw shadows running across the lawn. Once I saw a vaguely humanoid shadow scale the wall and disappear before my open eyes. Once I saw, well, you wouldn't believe me. And always that sense of something bad happened here, tightening my chest as I walked by. I'm here to write about the last time I ever went to that place, for the most part. It was one of those moments you can't forget, can't get rid of, that reshapes your life in some strange way that's unavoidable, like it was always leading toward that point. The shape didn't move. I raised my other hand, gave that silly little wave I hadn't last time, wondering if it would copy me as I did. It just stayed perfectly still, watching, blank. And a thought came into my head that feels weird to describe because it doesn't make sense now as I type it, as I think it over in my head again. I remember thinking, oh, she doesn't see me. I don't know why I thought of it as she. Here in the comfort of my home, here in the after, I only think of the shape as it. Then, however, it was a she, and I knew for certain that if I just got a little closer to her, she would be able to see me better, and so I took another step all the way up to the gate again, and reached my hand through the bars this time. Like all the way from the floor above, she would be able to take my hand somehow. Reaching up like a child, palm open, to be picked up and maybe held. My fingers felt a little colder in the chilly air on the other side of the gate. It still didn't move, and it still didn't seem to see me, so I thought, I just need to get closer. Again, fucking stupid. I can't explain to you where it came from, like some wayward rat had snuck inside my head and was chewing on the wires in my brain, a thought that was both mine and wasn't mine at all. Acting on this unknown urge, I pushed open the gate door that wasn't locked, and I walked into the yard. The path seemed to weirdly narrow in front of me, like it wasn't just a 5-meter little walkway dividing the street and the house. Like all of a sudden, it had width and breadth that it hadn't just a moment ago. And I swear I walked it for a full minute, and I still hadn't reached the porch, the figure in the window in my sight the entire time, following my path, guiding me like a lighthouse. And all around me it was strange and beautiful. Here the sky seemed clearer somehow, packed with more stars than outside, like there were extra constellations in the sky that I had never seen before. The moon was brighter, fuller, a perfectly round disk of silver in the sky, bathing everything a pale gray. The house shone in it. Its perfect white color reminded me of clean bone, the picked-apart carcass of a whale on the bottom of the deepest places in the sea. After all, the creatures that live down there have had their fill. A melancholy sight, almost. A little lonely, perhaps, beautiful still, its perfect arches and perfectly straight pillars holding up the roof, which in turn was holding up the sky, and the stars twinkled and the figure watching over me was still. I felt so at peace. For the first time in forever, for the first time ever maybe, the normally rushing thoughts in my head that roiled and churned were just quiet. Still, like the figure in the window, stilled by this odd architecture and its perfect symmetry. Every blade of grass was a perfect line, like nature never otherwise seems to accomplish, and on them little droplets reflected the moonlight like glass, like pearls of moisture on a spider's web. It hadn't been raining, it was too early for dew. The trees were moving, caught in some wind I couldn't feel myself, and they seemed to be swaying like dancers, rhythmic and giddy, chattering like a crowd at a concert right before the act shows up, all loud, excited whispers that bleed together to one loud hiss. Ready for the show. I kept on, and after a time long enough for me to wonder if I would ever reach the house, I was suddenly at the porch. The porch had been far away, the porch was now at my feet. I stopped for a second. I hesitated, frowning at it, some trace of normalcy kicking back into me. This isn't right, I remember thinking, feeling that car sickness you get when the world in your eyesight doesn't line up with what your inner ear is feeling, when everything is a too fast-moving blur of unfamiliar shapes. I remember thinking, this doesn't make any sense. They say just keep your eyes forward when you feel like that. Look straight ahead and focus on the horizon. Some fixed point ahead and the nausea will get better. So I raised my head again, up toward the window, up to the figure who must be able to see me better now. It didn't move, it still didn't react. In fact, it didn't seem to care about me at all, and for some reason I really wanted it to. I needed it to, so I took one slightly wobbly step toward the little stairs, the gravel crunching underneath my boot. A noise so loud it rang in my ears pierced the serene quiet. My hands flew toward my ears for some reason, hiding away from it, confused, looking around for the source in panic. The figure in the window slammed its fist against the glass so hard it rattled the wooden frame. The first and only real confirmation that it was a person, although of course it was a person, I knew it was, all along I knew. And its white fists pressed against the glass for a second and were gone again. They left no mark. I should have left then. If there was any concept of leaving still in my head, I would have. I can't explain it, but my mind had shrunk somehow. Rooms that had been open and leading into other rooms were shut, locked, and only simple and oddly connecting thoughts were left. She needs help, I thought. She's in trouble. She needs my help. It felt so right, that thought. Somehow it still feels right, but everything around it was just a blur, dysfunctional, broken apart. I swear it felt like that one time my friend and I took an acid trip from hell in the back of her dad's Volvo, and it took us both an hour to figure out how to open the door. Like that, but less pleasant. More pleasant. It's hard to say. The woman in the window needed my help, and I was right there. And who was going to stop me? The door was open. I knew the door would be open, I just did, and no one could even see me here, standing in the dark at the end of the street. Why would they even try? Don't worry, I thought to the shape in the window. Don't worry, I'm coming. And I took a step up the porch stairs, and then another, and then the last. I was on the porch and I couldn't see the window anymore, but I could hear another bang, even louder than before. It made me stop in my tracks for a moment, but only a moment. Then I was at the door and I realized that I needed to hurry or she might not make it. And I can't tell you what it was I thought she wouldn't make it from. But alarms were going off in my head and I needed to get inside. I should get inside. I was invited. Wanted. The inside was waiting for me. Another bang, and this time a scream. A blood-curdling thing. Booming noise, a scream so loud it should have woken up the whole street. Should have brought out at least one nosy neighbor to investigate, maybe call the police. There was no street here, there was nothing here. And everything that had been was far off now. Too far to hear or see. I needed to get inside. With every step I took, that figure in the window banged and yelled. And if there were words to it, they were unknowable, undistinguishable, muffled, like when you yell underwater and all that's coming out is bubbles, reaching the surface with nothing inside, empty, hollow, void of meaning. Still it kept screaming until I was at the door and my hand was almost on the handle, and I wanted to leave. I needed to get inside. Once again I leaned my head back and through an angle not possible saw the creature right above me. Saw nothing but it. Nothing but its blank face and that hair, long and black. Long like my mother's, the way I remember it on those rare days in the summer when she would let it out of her normally tight bun, when she would laugh and seem at ease in her own sharp way, never fully but a decent enough facsimile, and it would shine in the sun, and I thought she was so beautiful that I wanted to be like her when I grew up, that I never could because I was something small and dirty and unwanted, because she told me so. But she would smile then, and I knew she loved me, or the closest she had ever really gotten to that feeling. For some reason at that moment I missed her. It was a split-second thought, an incoherent echo from somewhere deep inside of me I never feel anymore. Somewhere small and desperate and helpless. Somewhere I thought was long gone and dead, like her. That died with her, and I was glad that it had. And I was glad she was dead, so glad that it was finally over. And I never thought about any. If that, because how the fuck do you have a conversation about things like that even with yourself? Those deep, dark things that never see daylight, that are pushed beneath shopping lists and bus tables and conversations with people you don't care about anything at all that isn't that. For a moment I was small again. I regressed years and years and became that girl from so long ago, or maybe someone else entirely, someone who saw clearer than I do, and the world seemed huge and strange and utterly terrifying. Something with razor-sharp teeth and blurry edges, like an old photograph taken in bad lighting. You took home from the developers and stared at, confused, trying to make sense of what you knew were familiar things you yourself had tried to capture. Happy moments that now didn't make sense to you at all. Just pitch black and pinpricks of light, and all I saw was black and pins of light. And I knew that they were stars, and I didn't know, and I didn't understand, and I missed my mother and tried to see, but I couldn't. The world was upside down. Everything before was everything behind, and the ground had opened up into the sky, and all things were eternal, and there was screaming, only screaming, and I didn't know if it was the thing in the window or me. And I could taste tears like an ocean on my tongue, and all around me were branches of trees that weren't trees, but a forest so dark and deep I would never find my way out, that weren't branches but teeth at the entrance of a gaping mouth, and a house that was not a house but was that mouth, open and waiting and somehow so inviting. And I would be happy there, I could be happy there, I could learn to be happy there, and all things were eternal, and I could be happy I could. The thing in the window slammed its fists against the glass so hard that I don't know how it didn't break it. It was only glass after all, and reality slammed just as harshly back into me. I let go of the handle, and I threw up, right there on the pristinely white front porch. I ran. I ran past the trees and out the gate, and was disoriented by how small everything seemed again. How it was only just a little garden with a little fence, and I was out in the street in maybe a few seconds. And there was the road looking like any old road, and that neighboring house was lit cozily. And it was safe, and it was normal. They were cooking something with cinnamon in it. I could smell the warm scent of it in the air as I heaved, as I cried on the side of the road like a lunatic. Behind me was just a house, nothing in the window, no light that wasn't light, just a house. I cried all the way home. I've stopped going back since. I've only been there once on an unassuming afternoon about a week ago, just to check, just to make sure. In that way you pick at open wounds. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't entirely off my rocker and there was a house there at all. That the ground hadn't swallowed it up and left a gaping hole in the ground or something. I made sure to pick a light, sweet day with pretty sunshine and people smiling. That smell of almost winter in the air that I love, always reminding me that it's my birthday soon. I never thought I'd get this old, and it's a good thought. And it was right there, clean and white and painfully ordinary, somehow more mundane to me than ever before in the daylight. Just a house. I looked at it for a while, and still no lights were on because of course they weren't. And I saw the guy that lives in the neighboring house out on the lawn, doing something to his car. Don't ask me what, I don't know anything about them. He seemed to be cheerfully tinkering under the hood of it, so I hoped I'd catch him in a good mood. Yes, he said he knew the house. It had remained quiet and peaceful for as long as he'd lived there. No, there wasn't anything odd about it. Why was I asking? It's just, I said, grasping at a suitable straw. I found the cat that sometimes leaves their yard, and I was wondering when they'd be around, the owners in that house. I had obviously not, and if I had, the thing would have probably clawed my eyes out or possessed my soul or something. It felt like a suitably horror protagonist thing to say, though, and the guy nodded slowly. Sure that, he said, as if remembering the little beast brought as much anxiety in him as it did in me. It was weirdly comforting that I wasn't alone. He stroked his chin in thought, and a black smear of oil was left on his chin. He looked distant for a moment, far off. I agree, they're not around much, although sometimes I can see. Sometimes there's a... In the backyard? I knew what was in their backyard. We avoided each other's eyes until he coughed, snapping out of wherever he'd gone awkwardly. I thanked him for not knowing much but trying, and I grabbed a few apples out of the basket and hurried off, hoping I wouldn't be that weirdo neighbor from now on. Things like that spread easily, and I'm already a bit of a peculiar figure, walking around late at night in my vampire coat and docks. I'm starting to wonder just how much strange shit goes on in this world, because I know now that you don't tell anyone about it when it does. You lock it up inside your head and forget, choose to forget. Do your very best to forget. What would I say if I did say something you would call me crazy? So just this once I've written it all down before I let it fade away or really go nuts. I don't have time for that. I've worked too damn hard to really let myself slip away, especially to a moment of recklessness and stupid, morbid curiosity. Hey, I guess that's what they'd call progress. A few years ago I wouldn't have thought that way at all. A few years ago I was chasing every socket I could find to stick my finger in, but I'm tired. It does eat at me a little, of course it does. The fear and the doubt, the memory of floating into emptiness like some unholy sea, of being trapped forever. I'm only human. Sometimes I can't sleep. I try not to think about it too much, not to let me brain do that thing where it spirals into places too deep to crawl out of. I've stopped drinking entirely, and that helps. I've taken up running, would you believe it? I have the stupid shoes and water bottle with a little reflex and everything, and it helps too. I hate it, but it helps. My route is an entirely different direction to that fucking thing, and I stay as far away as I can. It helps. I've bought a snowflake string light for my balcony. I vape like a dickhead. I've decided to make this place a home, not just somewhere I live. I hope someone out there maybe gets a kick out of this, because I still love a good story, and I always will. And that's what it'll have to be to me now. Just a story before one day hopefully I forget all about it, stop sleeping with the light on. Just a story about a house. Just a house. But you know it's not. The only thing that really keeps me up and frays at my nerve endings are the dreams that sometimes slip through. Flashes of that night, the shape in the window, it screams. Normal enough, and they're becoming very rare. But every once in a while something slips through and I can't focus on anything else. The feeling of being sucked underwater stays with me all day. The worst part is the more I analyze everything from a safer distance, the less I believe my first impressions. The more I have them, the more I'm becoming certain of what it was screaming at me, and I don't think it was threatening. I'll never be 100% positive, but I'm pretty sure it was, don't.